And it's not J for dental surgery, it's just J for I just need to go to the dentist. I'm audible, yes! Thank you, Interiority. Right, yes, I'm going to have to get the content warnings out of the chatbot thing, because apparently Twitch is being mean tonight. There we go. I am not owned by Amazon, no, not as far as I'm aware. So yes, those are the content warnings for this stream. Lots of them for Yellow Fog, because it's long and Victorian. Especially colonialism. And then if I actually get to the as far as vintage domestic, because oh boy, is Yellow Fog quite long. It's a novella. It's basically a novella. It stops about there. A lot of it. So back to the normal book. This will be the, assuming I get everything read, the penultimate vampire marathon, because after these two there are two more left, and one is a poem. So somehow I've managed to get through this entire volume on streams, probably because I've been doing it for months now. There you go. I suppose I'd better crack on with Yellow Fog, really, because it's so long. I hope I'll be finished before 11. I'll probably have to take a break partway through. So, Les Daniels, Yellow Fog. Les Daniels has been a freelance writer, composer, film buff, and musician. His first book was Comics, A History of Comic Books in America, 1971. In 1991 saw the publication of Marvel, his huge history of Marvel Comics. He also wrote the non-fiction study Living in Fear, A History of Horror in the Mass Media, and edited the anthologies Dying of Fright, Masterpieces of the Macabre, and 13 Tales of Terror with Diane Thompson. I think I've read that. His short fiction has been published in Cutting Edge, Book of the Dead, Borderlands, The Sea Harp Hotel, After the Darkness, and Dark Voices 4, The Pattern Book of Horror, while his articles have appeared in various newspapers. Shock Express, Horror, 100 Best Books, Supernatural Fiction Writers, Fantasy and Horror, and World Fantasy Convention Program Books. If I got a publication every time I was in a program book for a convention, then, well, no, for a conference, I'd have quite a lot of publications. Same kind of abstracts. In 1978, Daniels introduced his enigmatic vampire hero, something said, Don Sebastian de Villanueva, in his debut novel, The Black Castle. He has since resurrected... we'll get to Don Sebastian Villanueva. He has since resurrected the character in a series of superior horror novels, The Silver Skull, Citizen Vampire, Yellow Fog, an expanded version of the short novel that appears here, and No Blood Spilled. A sixth Sebastian novel entitled White Demon is forthcoming. 1. Black Plumes. The boy on the steps had been told to look unhappy, and he was doing his best, but he found it hard to mourn for a corpse he'd never known, especially when the old man's death was making him money. Still, a job was a job, and Sid had no desire to lose this one. He stifled a smirk and glanced across the black-draped door toward his partner, but the sight of the old fellow with his fancy dress and his watery eyes was more than Sid could bear. He knew he must look just as foolish himself, wearing a top hat festooned with black crape and carrying a long wand draped with more of the same. Yet he felt a laugh rising in his chest that he barely succeeded in changing into a cough before it reached his lips. The crape rustled, and Sid's partner altered his expression for an instant, from dignified melancholy to threatening wrath. Mr. Callender had paid Entwistle and Son a substantial sum for a proper funeral, and that meant the mutes would remain mute. Sid stiffened, hoping that the procession would arrive soon to relieve him of his post. His nose itched, and his left foot seemed to have gone numb. After a whole morning standing on duty in front of Callender's house, Sid was beginning to look to the long march to All Souls as a positive pleasure. It would at least mean a bit of exercise, and it would bring Sid closer to the time when he would finally be able to make a little profit out of the business. There was no play in being apprenticed to an undertaker, even if it was Entwistle and Son. Just the son, now, actually, thought Sid, and it didn't look like he could expect to live much longer himself, except that he couldn't bear the thought of dying and letting anybody else bury him. Entwistle and Son was the best there was, and the hearse Sid saw turning the corner from Kensington High Street proved it. 6 matched black horses drew the hearse, their heads crowned with bobbing black plumes of dyed peacock feathers, their backs covered with hangings of black velvet. The low black hearse, its glass sides etched into floral patterns, bore the oaken coffin upon a bed of lilies, under a canopy of more swaying black plumes. The driver proceeded at a measured pace to accommodate the mutes, who trudged with downcast eyes beside the slowly rolling gilt-edged wheels. Behind them came the first mourning coach, and then the second. When the procession drew up before the house, Sid was startled to see that there were no more. It seemed incredible that such an expensive funeral should have so few mourners. Sid could hardly believe that the man rich enough to afford Entwistle's best should have had so few friends. The son himself stepped from the second coach, the crape on his hat fluttering across his face in the brisk autumn breeze. Sid snapped to attention like the soldiers he had seen outside Buckingham Palace guarding the Queen, and stared straight ahead as the Undertaker glided up the steps with the black cloth, alternately masking and unmasking his pale and furrowed face. Sid had learned long ago not to fear the dead, but he still feared the man who tended them, and he did not look to the side when he heard the sound of the brass door knocker. Shuffling steps approached the door, and the latch clicked. "Mr. Calendar, please," said Mr. Entwistle. "Mr. Calendar asked that you wait from outside," came the reply. The door closed quietly. Sid stood so rigidly that he was starting to tremble as Mr. Entwistle made his way stiffly down the steps and toward the second coach. Sid's feelings were a mixture of shock and delight. He saw that the expression on the face of his fellow mute was now genuinely grief-stricken. It was a revelation to discover a household too grand to receive Mr. Entwistle, and Sid was far too impressed to do anything but stare when the door opened again to let the funeral party out. There was a fat butler, a young gentleman with sandy side whiskers, and a little lady with grey hair, but what Sid noticed was the one who stood behind them in the shadows. Her skin was fair, her eyes were of the lightest blue, and her hair was a blonde that was nearly white. There was next to no colour in her, and she was as beautiful as a statue. All of them were dressed in black, and the little lady had the younger one by the arm. "There's no need for you to come, Felicia," she said. "It's not the sort of thing a young lady ought to see." "And yet you're going, Aunt Penelope." "I'm no longer a young lady, and we can't send Mr. Calendar off alone on such a sad errand." "But surely my place is with Reginald, Aunt Penelope." "You've done more than enough for him already, and if he loves you, he wouldn't dream of exposing you to such an ordeal. Besides, you're needed here to keep an eye on the servants, or there won't be much left of the feast by the time we return." Neither the butler nor the master made any comment on this or anything else, but when the older woman said, "I'll hear no more about it," the young gentleman took her arm and the butler closed the door behind them. Sid, whose only concern had been the pale angel who stayed behind, recollected himself and returned to his job, escorting Reginald Calendar and the angel's aunt, Penelope, to the first mourning coach. One of the horses stirred despite its blinders as they passed. Everything else was still but Aunt Penelope's tongue. "A grey day is just as well for a funeral, I think. It's appropriately solemn, but not really unpleasant. The day we buried poor Felicia's parents, the rain was so heavy it was almost a storm, and the child was crying so much on top of it. I don't think I've ever been so wet in all my born days. I really think it affected her, too. She's always been so delicate. A sunny day is not right either, though. I remember burying a cousin when the day was so fine that it quite spoiled the occasion. It just wasn't fitting. No, I think a grey day is best." She gestured decisively with her fan of black plumes and waited for Sid to open the carriage door. "Uncle William chose the day, not I," said Reginald Calendar as he helped Aunt Penelope up the step. "Nonsense! If your Uncle William had his choice to stay, never would have come at all. He would rather have spent his fortune than left it all to you, Mr. Calendar. Not that you'll need it, with such a wealthy wife soon to be yours. It is a fine thing, though, is it not, to see two family fortunes joined along with their heirs?" "No doubt," replied Calendar as the door shut behind them, and he took his seat beside his fiancée's aunt. His head throbbed already, and he realised that burying his uncle would be more of an ordeal than whatever grief he felt would warrant. Last night he had taken too much whiskey to calm his nerves and muffle his tactless conviction that he was, in his hour of bereavement, the luckiest man alive. What more could a man wish but riches and a beautiful wife, except to be free of the headache and a chattering woman who seemed to dote on death? "It's a tragedy of the funeral party being so small, don't you think? Of course, everything has been done in the very height of fashion, but it seems a shame that nobody's here to enjoy it." "My uncle survived all his partners by some years, and I'm his last living relative, as you know, last of the Calendars. There is simply no one left to mourn him." "And Felicia looks so lovely in the black silk. She can't keep wearing it, you know. She's not really in mourning, but it was so dear that it certainly should be seen. I took her to Jay's in Regent Street, you know. They make a speciality of mourning, and they furnished both of us for your uncle's funeral." "Very handsomely, to be sure," murmured Calendar, eyeing a hand behind his head in a gesture that he hoped would suggest intelligent interest, while providing him with the opportunity to massage an aching temple. The motion of the coach was beginning to make him slightly sick. "Oh,
course, I've had dresses from Jays before. So many of one's family seem to die as the years pass. I think the widow's weeds are most attractive, but a woman can't be a widow before she's a wife, can she?
Calendar might have answered, but Aunt Penelope had turned from him to gaze out of the coach into the streets of London.
I see you have chosen to travel by way of the park, she said. Very wise, I'm sure. I thought you might have chosen the shorter route instead, where we should hardly have been seen at all.
It was my uncle's wish, said Calendar. He left instructions for his funeral with his solicitor, Mr. Frobisher.
What a clever man. I never thought of such a thing, but I must certainly make plans for my own passing at the first possible moment. Of course, I have no fortune to compensate my heirs for the expense.
I'm sure that Felicia will be happy to accommodate you, sighed Calendar.
Do you think so? Yes, I suppose she will. Such a generous girl and such a spiritual nature. Her thoughts are always with the angels.
Calendar wished fervently that Aunt Penelope could be with the angels too. He closed his eyes and thought of Felicia. Just a moment's peace would be enough to bring him sleep.
Then Kensal Green was your uncle's choice as well?
I beg your pardon? Said Calendar, pulling himself back to consciousness.
Kensal Green, that's it. All Souls Cemetery. It's certainly where I would choose to rest in peace. I visit there sometimes, and I still think it's the loveliest cemetery in London, even if there are a few that have been open since. The first of anything is often the best, don't you think? You must have heard the stories about the pestilence but in those awful places. By the way, the skeletons were dug up and stored in sheds to make way for more graves. It's enough to make a body shudder.
Calendar looked up to see if she was shuddering, almost thought he saw her waving at a passer-by, but he could not be certain. Although thoroughly dismayed by her enjoyment of the proceedings, he decided to resign himself. He had little choice in any case, and a day of pleasure for his beloved's maiden aunt was a small enough additional tax on the life of happiness that lay before him. He settled back in his seat as the coach rolled on. Felicia Lamb closed her book and sat for a moment staring into space. Critics had attacked the novel and its unknown author, Ellis Bell, and Felicia admitted to herself,
That is a Bronte sister. That is the code name for a Bronte sister, the pen name for a Bronte sister.
Ellis would be Elizabeth, I think. And Felicia admitted, I'm just going to give you whenever I see a reference, I'm going to call it out, okay? And if you already noticed it, jolly good. Felicia admitted to herself that she's sometimes been dismayed by the savagery of its setting and the brutishness of its characters. It's probably Wuthering Heights, I guess. I think, yeah, maybe I might have the right. Don't know if the right one there. I may even have the wrong Bronte sister, or I've invented a Bronte sister. Who can say? Anybody who Googles. Yet something in the story had compelled her interest. The idea of an immortal love that transcended even death. Such a passion both fascinated and frightened her. Half of her longed for something like it, but she realised that destiny had decided to provide her with a much more practical match. Reginald Calendar had his virtues, as her Aunt Penelope was frequently at pain to point out, but she could hardly imagine anyone accusing him of a supernatural longing. Perhaps it was just as well, Felicia thought. She knew that she was inclined towards morbidity, as certainly her father's sister was, so it was possible that her fiancé had been sent to help keep her feet firmly planted on the ground. She sighed and placed the last volume of Wuthering Heights on the highly polished surface of a table in the centre of the drawing room. What light from the afternoon sky pressed through the heavy curtains was weak and dismal. The pendulum of the clock in the corner seemed to push the hours on towards darkness. Surely it was late enough for Reginald and Aunt Penelope to have returned. Against her will, Felicia pictured a terrible accident that might at one blow deprive her of the only two people whose lives touched her own. She realised it was a foolish fancy, yet she had lost both her parents at once a dozen years ago, and knew all too well that such things were possible. She had more faith in the next world than when she had in her chances for happiness in this one. She gazed up at the portrait of Reginald's Uncle William that hung magisterially over the mantel, and she wondered where he was now. The round, ruddy face and the thick body were of course in a coffin under 6 feet of earth. But where was William Calendar himself? And where were her mother and father? The spirits of the dead haunted her without ever appearing as phantoms. Perhaps she would have been less troubled by them if they had. She longed for Reginald to return and pull her away from such brooding, even though she always half resented him when he did. "Shall I light the fire, miss?" A ghost would have startled her less than the voice did, but she realised in an instant that it was only the butler. And while she doubted that flames could eliminate the chill she felt within her, a cheery fire would at least be welcome to anyone returning from a long funeral on a raw autumn day. "Thank you, Booth. I think Mr. Calendar would appreciate it." She heard his knees creak as he bent before the picture of his late master, and she felt a twinge of regret that she had not tended to the matter herself. It would have been much easier for her than it was for the old man. Her guilt propelled her from the room to supervise the preparations for the funeral feast, but she was not really needed for that either. Is everything ready, Alice? She asked the pretty dark-haired maid. The girl, whose black uniform had lost its white ruffles to the dignity of the day, gave Felicia a curtsy and a small smile.
Oh, yes, miss, thank you. Mr. Entwistle's people took care of everything themselves. It's very nice, I'm sure.
The sideboard was covered with food, a ham, a roast of beef, bread, pies, cakes and bottles of sherry and port. There was enough to feed dozens of people, although only 3 were to be served. So much? Asked Felicia, without stopping to consider the propriety of conversing with the servants on matters of form.
Oh, yes, miss, I asked him if there might be some mistake, but the gentleman assured me it was all called for in Mr. Calendar's will. May I serve you something, miss?
Thank you, no, answered Felicia, who had never felt that hungry in her life.
I'll wait for the others, Alice. Do I hear them coming in now? I'll go see, miss,
said the maid as she scurried off. A moment later, Felicia was joined by her Aunt Penelope, her eyes bright beneath her black bonnet as she surveyed the lavish meal spread out before her.
Well, she said, this is very handsomely done, Felicia, and so it should be, I say. Weddings and funerals are important occasions. Will you pour me a glass of sherry, dear, just a small one?
Aunt Penelope popped a small cake into her mouth as Reginald Calendar strode into the room and reached for a bottle of port. He filled a glass and swallowed it at once.
A lovely funeral, Mr. Calendar, said Aunt Penelope. And the mausoleum was very splendid indeed. Did your uncle make provisions for you to join him there when you were called?
Calendar made no reply except to pour himself another drink. He collected himself enough to offer a glass to Felicia, but she refused it and seated herself on a small, straight-backed chair in the corner.
I don't think I approve of closed coffins, however, said Aunt Penelope.
Calendar's face turned suddenly hard. Surely you saw enough of my uncle when he was lying in state, didn't you?
Oh, to be sure, Mr. Calendar, I meant no criticism. Sometimes I suppose the last look may be too painful to endure. Would you be kind enough to offer me some of that ham? Thank you. How have you spent the day, Felicia?
In thinking of those who have gone before us, Aunt.
Oh, and what were your conclusions, dear?
Only that there is much to know, and we know very little of it, said Felicia.
Perhaps you may be wiser tomorrow evening, after our visit to Mr. Newcastle.
Felicia's eyes widened, and she glanced anxiously back and forth between her aunt and her fiancé. Newcastle? And who, pray, is Mr. Newcastle that you should visit him at night? Demanded Calendar, brandishing the carving knife as he passed a plate of ham to Aunt Penelope.
Why, the spirit medium, of course, she said as she took the plate. We passed his house on the way to Kensal Green.
Felicia sank further into her corner under Calendar's accusing stare. The spirit medium? He roared, then turned to Aunt Penelope. Is this some of your nonsense? It is my own idea, Reginald, Felicia said quietly. I positively forbid it. You will forbid me nothing before I become your wife. You know how I long to know what lies beyond this life. Why should you want to deny me? Because it's all fraud and nonsense and superstition. How can an intelligent girl like you believe in such antiquated fancies in this day and age? This is 1847, and we're in an age of progress when such things should be cast aside once and for all. This is 1847! We progress in many things, Reginald, and why should not the knowledge of what lies beyond the veil be one of them? And I am told that Mr. Newcastle's gifts are even more remarkable. I am certain that there are persons with the ability to see things that are invisible to us. When they see what's invisible to you is that you are a gullible woman with too much money. What's dead is dead, Felicia, and best forgotten. She rose from her chair and clasped her hands together earnestly. But the dead do live on, Reginald. How can you doubt it? Aren't you a Christian? Calendar hacked viciously at the ham. Yes, I'm a Christian. Church of England every Sunday and money in the plate. What do you think the Reverend Mr. Fisher would say if he knew you were raising spooks? And what do you really know about this fellow Newcastle? Must be a lunatic. It isn't safe, and I ask you again to forget this folly. I have promised to act as my niece's chaperone, volunteered Aunt Penelope as she helped herself to more sherry, and in exchange she has agreed to accompany me to the dead room at Madame Tussaud's. Neither of us is quite brave enough to indulge her fancy alone, but we do intend to have our curiosity satisfied, Mr. Calendar. What? The place Punch calls the Chamber of Horrors? It's a fine place for a sensitive girl, I must say. At least I suppose it's harmless. But this Master of Goblins is quite another matter. He's either a charlatan or a madman. And the fact that you are 2 helpless females instead of 1 does nothing to reassure me. I'll wager he wants more than a few shillings for admission, too, eh? Aunt Penelope moved to her niece's side and put a hand on her shoulder, which Felicia took gratefully. We shall not be dissuaded, said Aunt Penelope. Calendar smiled ruefully. I suppose I must accompany you, he said. Oh, Reginald, will you? Felicia asked eagerly.
Please come with us. I hope to speak with my mother and father again, and perhaps Mr. Newcastle will let you commune with your Uncle William.
I trust my Uncle William is happy to stay where he is, Felicia, and I would not wish to drag him down again to the clay, even if I believed I could. Let him rest in peace, I say. He put his arms around Felicia and led her across the room to a love seat, as far removed as possible from the food that the dead man had ordered. Can you not forget the dead? He asked her. We are among the living now, and whatever questions we have to ask of our forebears will be answered in due time. Until then, it is our duty to live our lives as best we can. Will you live for me instead of these idle dreams? Felicia's fingers stroked his face, but her eyes remained distant. How can we know what we should do, she demanded, when we do not know what lies ahead of us? How much pleasure can we take here, when we know it is only a school for the lessons we shall learn? You may have been born to die, said Calendar, but that is only part of it. The pleasures offered to us here are not our enemies. We are young and wealthy, Felicia. We are blessed. Let us not spurn fate's favours.
He is right, you know,
said Aunt Penelope as she cut into a pie.
We shall be quit of this world soon enough without denying it. But still, Mr. Calendar, we shall make our visits.
And if you must, he said, I shall be with you. He might have said more, but the butler interrupted him. Yes, Booth, he murmured as the old man bent down to whisper in his ear. Calendar rose, bowed to the ladies, and hurried out into the hall. And there in the twilight stood the gaunt form of Mr. Entwistle. I know how these things are, sir, he said. I would not wish to keep you waiting. He handed Calendar a few small objects tied in a handkerchief. His rings, his pins, and his watch, he said. Calendar cringed, but thanked the undertaker nonetheless. I understand entirely, said Mr. Entwistle. It is not at all uncommon for young gentlemen to experience a temporary embarrassment while waiting for the reading of the will. You may be sure that your uncle's estate will compensate us for your trouble. He bowed and slithered back into the gathering darkness. Reginald Calendar stood with his uncle's jewellery in his hand, a wave of disgust pouring over him. While Felicia worried about souls, he was forced to concern himself with the problem of raising enough money to keep the household in order. It was hardly gentlemanly behaviour, in fact it was almost like robbing the dead. Still, his uncle's adornments had been visible in the open coffin, yet had been rescued from the grave. Supported since childhood by the investments of his mother's brother, Calendar truly had no option of supporting himself except to sell what came to hand. It was only a temporary aberration, he told himself, seeing the estate would make him rich. Still, he was angry with himself, and more angry with Felicia for concerning herself with spirits when he was so desperate for material comfort. He saw the maid hurrying across the hallway and called out to her. Alice, he said, come here for a moment. The girl came slowly towards him. Are you happy with your position here?
Oh, yes, sir, said Alice.
And were you happy with my uncle? Alice blushed and nodded. Then shall we continue the same arrangement now that I am master?
Just as you say, sir, said Alice.
Very well. My visitors will be leaving soon. I shall expect you later this evening, Alice. Everything will be as it was before. I will expect you at 10. And bring my uncle's riding crop. Yeah. No, I did put abuse of power in there, yes. 2. The Resurrection Men. The boy with the crowbar strapped to his leg ordered another pint of beer. He rarely drank the stuff because it cost too much and he had no head for it anyway, but tonight he felt jumpy as a cat, and certain of enough money to buy a whole barrow if he needed. And anyway, he told himself, it would be Sid's fault if he got drunk. They had agreed to meet an hour ago in this pub. The world turned upside down. Okay, enjoy your game, Interiority. Have a good time. And I will invent 20 more Brontes. It is Elizabeth, isn't it? Elizabeth, Anne, and Catherine, maybe? I'll have to look it up. You would think I would know that, given I've written for a podcast with them in. Oh well. Yeah, have a good time. So they'd agreed to meet an hour ago in this pub. The world turned upside down, and since Sid was so late, it became necessary to keep buying beer. Henry could hardly expect to stay inside without spending money, and even at that there had been a few jokes about his age. But Henry Donaghy was unconcerned. Excuse me. He was 15 after all, and old enough to drink all he could hold, and old enough to rob a grave. Still, he wished Sid would hurry. Henry had picked the place for himself, even though he had never been inside before, partly for its proximity to Kensal Green, and partly because he had always liked its sign. Whether the globe on it was really upside down he could not have said, but something in the idea appealed to him, and things were quiet enough inside, which he supposed was good, though he would have preferred enough of a crowd to make him feel a bit less conspicuous. He was looking around the dim room, convinced that all the other patrons were watching him, when he saw the door open and Sid's sharp, pimply face peer in. Henry gulped down the last of his drink and walked briskly towards the door. Sid was halfway inside, but Henry pushed him out again.
Let me come in for a minute, will you? Protested Sid. You're late enough without dawdling here any longer, don't you think? I know, but I'm cold enough already, aren't I? Is it my fault if I couldn't get away? It'll be your fault for any later, Sid. I can't be out all night, you know. You smell like you already have been, mate. Fine thing, drinking on the job. You won't be much good for picking locks now, will you?
Henry grabbed Sid's arm to quiet him. A lamplighter was shuffling down the empty street towards them, the yellow fog of London dimming in the light of the small hand lamp he carried. The two boys leaned against the building with feigned unconcern. Henry gazing at the sign while Sid read the words guaranteeing the availability of Courage and Company's entire, and wondered how much of it Henry had consumed. The old man climbed up his ladder, turned the gas cock, applied his lamp, and scrambled down again, leaving the entrance to the public house only a little brighter than it had been before. The boys waited until his footsteps died away.
You were really scared of him, weren't you?
Sneered Sid.
Maybe you should run home now and forget all this, Henry. I'm not scared of anything. There's no point in letting anyone know what we're up to, is there? Burke and Hare were hanged, weren't they? They were murderers, you dunce, and we're not even stealing bodies. There's no market for them anywhere, is there? All we're doing now is relieving some old gent of some jewellery he'll never miss. It would be a crime to let it rot with him, wouldn't it? Not a crime you can be charged with, Henry said. Well, if you don't want the money, mate, you run along.
But Henry was already walking towards the cemetery, pulling his cap down over his shaggy red hair, and turning his collar up against the cold in the eyes of passers-by.
You sure he's got all this stuff on you, are you, Sid? I saw it, didn't I? There's not much else to do when you work for an undertaker but look at the bodies. Just like there's not much for an apprentice locksmith to do but learn how to open things. I've been waiting to meet a partner like you, Henry. We're in business now, you know, and we have splendid prospects.
The closer they got to Kensal Green, the more unhappy Henry was. The houses were thinning out there. The lights were further apart, and fog filled the empty spaces. Excuse me, I need a drink of water, sorry. Henry began to feel as if they were lost somewhere out in the countryside, and would have happily turned back at once except for a certain reluctance to disgrace himself in front of Sid. It was easier to face corpses than to admit to a boy a year older than himself that he wanted nothing more out of life than to be back in his bed in a garret. Henry watched his feet slip over the damp cobblestones. They were almost all he could see. The dark was bad enough, but the fog was worse.
We'll never find it, Henry said. What do you mean we'll never find it? We're here.
Henry looked up and saw something like a temple looming through the mist. There were columns and walls and fences, and it looked to him less like a churchyard than the Bank of England. The gigantic gates were clearly locked, and he could perceive nothing behind them but another wall of impenetrable fog.
I don't want to open them gates, he said. Someone might come along. Don't worry, Sid insisted. We'll just climb the wall. What's the use? We can't find anything in there. The fog. I know where it is, don't I? How many times have I been in here, eh? It's my job. Just give me a leg up. Come on, over here.
Henry almost ran away, but he didn't. Instead, he hurried towards the sound of Sid's voice, and was almost relieved to be touching someone else, even if it was his partner in a crime that he would have willingly abandoned. At least he was not alone. He squatted close to the ground where the air was a little clearer and made his hands into a cradle for Sid's foot. Sid scrambled up, and Henry thought for an instant that he had broken a wrist. He grunted and then lost Sid in the fog. Where are you? You up? A hand dropped down to him. Here, grab it. Come on, get off the street. Henry grabbed onto Sid's wrist and felt himself hauled up against the wall, scraping and squirming until he reached the top. You're up, said Sid, and drop down. Suddenly Henry was alone again. He looked into the opaque night, shivered at the thought of an observer, and then dropped into the darkness. He landed on Sid, and then both of them tumbled onto the wet grass of All Souls Cemetery. That's fine, you'll kill us both. Are we in? Where are we, Sid? Kensal Green, my boy. We're in. Follow me. Wait a minute, Sid. Where are you? You can't know where we're going. I tell you, I know this place like I know my mother, even if I haven't seen her for years. Give us your hand then, will you? I'm lost. Take hold then. You'll hold a prettier hand than this one once we're done. Henry hung on to Sid, wandering through a sea of fog that might have been heaven or hell. From time to time, a monument loomed up, a spire or an angel or a slab. A monument loomed up, a spire or an angel or a slab. Some of them were huge. He let Sid drag him through the clouds. It was so cold that his nose began to run, and all at once he was hungry. We'll never find it, Sid. Let's go home. No, we'll never find it. Something loomed in the fog. Henry blinked twice and then sat down. It's big enough, he said. The lock is small. A grey box squatted in the yellow fog. A stone box, its roof pointed with pillars beside the door. Two figures made of marble stood on either side of the door. They looked to Henry like women in nightshirts. He couldn't see much, but what he saw was enough. Sid knocked on the door while Henry shuddered. Mr. Callender's residence? Don't do that, Sid. Nah, think you'll wake up, do you? Don't worry, I threw his guts away myself. If he did rise up, he'd fall right over. That's not funny. Don't laugh then, just open the door. I can't. You haven't even tried it yet. You're terrified, that's what's wrong with you. I can't see, can I? How do you expect me to work? I've got a bunch of lucifers, and I told you what the lock is like. Just work. The sooner you start, the sooner we'll be out of here. Sid lit a match, and the way it coloured his eyes was enough to send Henry towards the lock. He reached into his pocket and produced several instruments. I'd love to know how to work them. I'll teach you, then you could do this by yourself. Don't be like that. Just a few more minutes and we'll be rich men, Henry. You take care of the lock and I'll take care of the body, all right? Splendid, muttered Henry, his stiff fingers fumbling. He heard something snap and then wished he hadn't. Sid pushed him out towards the metal door and then fell away before them into hideous blackness. Henry twitched and looked towards the sky, but all he saw was the name Calendar carved in the marble over his head. He lost his balance and sprawled against a wet wall as Sid shoved him into the house of the dead. The stink of dying flowers turned his stomach. He sat down in a corner and watched Sid strike another match and light a candle with it. The light flickered around stone walls like slabs. Henry looked outside and glimpsed a shadow. Something out there, Sid. Ghosts. That'd be smart. I saw a dog. Then shut the door and you won't see us. Too late for that, he said, and pushed the iron door back. Immediately he felt trapped. He hurriedly caught the edge of the door before it could swing shut, pulled the crowbar out from under the leg of his ragged trousers and braced it against the jamb. The opening allayed his fear slightly, even when he saw wisps of fog drift through it, but Sid was not pleased with his handiwork. What do you think you're doing with that, then? You've been walking stiff-legged all night so we could have a doorstop. Give it here. Henry handed over reluctantly, unhappy to be farther from the exit and closer to the sinister oblong of stone that brooded in the centre of the small dark room. Sid stuck the candle to the floor with its drippings, then turned to the sarcophagus and began to pry off the lid. Henry backed away at the hideous sound of scraping, grating stone and put one foot outside the tomb, relieved to find that they were not already imprisoned by some uncanny force. Sid pushed and grunted against the ponderous weight, while Henry prayed that he would have failed to move it. You could help, gasped Sid. Bargain's a bargain. Bargain's a bargain. Lock was my job, body's yours. It's only another box in there, it won't hurt you. I know it won't, since I'm not going near it. All right, then. Sid threw himself furiously on the bar, and the stone slab tilted ominously. For an instant he hung counterbalanced in the air. Then the lid screeched and fell to the floor with a crash that sounded to Henry like the end of the world. And at the same instant, Sid dropped on the other side and snuffed out the candle. The echoing tomb was black. Oh my God, spit Henry. He's not likely much help to you when you're a job like this one, is he, mate? Something shuffled in the dark, and another of Sid's matches burst into flame, marking his face as red as a painted devil's, but no less reassuring to Henry for that. He was amazed to discover that he had not run away, then realised that he had been too startled to move. Sid lit the broken candle and handed it to him. How this? He said. I don't want to look. Of course you do. I bet that's half of why you came. Henry didn't answer, but neither did he turn away when Sid approached the oaken coffin on its bed of stone. The candle flame shimmered in his shaking hand, and he knew without a doubt that when the coffin opened, a hideously mouldering corpse would rise from its depths and drag him straight to hell. He thought he heard a dog howl from somewhere outside. He closed his eyes. Wood croaked, and then he heard Sid groan. The groan rose into a wail. We've been robbed! What? Henry opened his eyes, and for a second instant saw nothing but Sid's red, furious face. For yourself, it must have been old Whistle, the grasping bloody bastard. He's taken it all. The rings, the watch, the stick pin too. There's nothing left but the damn body. Unwilling to believe his ears, Henry moved the light until he could see into the coffin. He quickly checked the pale fingers in the black cravat. Nothing gleamed on them. He began to curse, then realised he was staring into the face of a dead man. It was not as bad as he had imagined, just a plump old boy with rosy cheeks. Really nothing to be afraid of. He looked as if he was taking a nap. It was only when Henry's nostrils caught the mingled odours of flowers, chemicals, and death that his stomach began to heave. And then the iron door behind him crashed open. Henry screamed, dropped the candle, and spun towards the sound. Silhouetted against the foggy night stood the gigantic figure of a man, his outstretched arms barring the way out of the tomb. Henry's mind went blank, his fanciful fear of the corpse forgotten in the sudden and very real conviction that he was doomed. The blood drained out of his face as he saw himself on the gallows, and he could hold on to only one idea. And caught. He hardly heard the low, calm voice of the figure at the door. Have you found what you seek? Henry was amazed to hear Sid's brassy answer.
Now there's nothing here. Somebody stripped him bare.
Another match flared. Sid's hand was steady, his expression instant.
Bring that candle over here, will you, Henry?
Henry was startled into action, always believing that Sid's boldness might somehow set them free. Not even a second flame showed much of the dark intruder's face, and then he spoke again. These dead are mine.
And welcome to 'em,
answered Sid, moving back towards the doorway with a crowbar held behind his back. Henry followed him like a somnambulist, but stopped dead when he saw the tall man's face. The skin was pale under long, stringy black hair. The lips were hidden by a drooping black moustache. The eyes seemed no more than dark hollows, left bisected by a scar that ran from brow to chin. The countenance was so expressionless that it might have been a mask.
It's not the caretaker, Henry found himself saying. It's that spirit reader from across the way.
That's torn it, said Sid, and he swung for the man's head with the crowbar. The blow never landed. Henry stood frozen and watched a long white hand shoot out to grasp Sid's wrist while another attached itself to his face, the fingers scrabbling like a pale spider. The man opened his arms in a gesture that seemed almost hospitable, and Sid's hand came off at the wrist in a shower of blood, while the flesh of his face was ripped from his bones. Henry dropped the candle again and dove for the darkness where the door had been. He tumbled to the ground in a blind panic and crawled through the yellow fog. He thought about God. He ran. A tree stopped him. It bloodied his nose and broke 2 fingers, but he got up and ran again. A low tombstone caught him just below the kneecap. He rolled in the wet grass and then whimpered. Then he arose and limped away. He couldn't see where he was going, but he didn't stop until the agony of his broken leg compelled him to. He rested under a marble angel and waited for death to come. It came on black wings. 3. The Spiritualist. I need to hydrate. Is anybody still in? Oh! Ah, hi, Cyan. Right, okay. The house near the cemetery where he had buried his Uncle William was so nondescript that Reginald Calendar scarcely remembered having passed it twice before. He was almost disappointed. He had expected something either gaudy or else picturesquely dilapidated and sinister. But Mr. Sebastian Newcastle's dwelling was an unpretentious house of good English brick, perhaps 50 years old. The tall cypresses surrounding it had a slightly funereal air, but that was all. Every window was dark but one, which glowed faintly through the fog. Calendar had accompanied Felicia and her Aunt Penelope despite his misgivings. He was not a man to tolerate argument from a woman, especially one he expected to have as his bride. And he was deeply suspicious of Felicia's interest in this spirit medium, who was certainly a charlatan and probably a criminal who preyed on the sentiments of bereaved ladies. And the fact that the man he already thought of as his enemy was so unpretentious in his tastes gave Calendar pause. Subtlety always irritated him. He helped Aunt Penelope out of the coach, and then Felicia, listening with approval when she told the driver to wait. Soon he would be giving orders to her servants himself, but until his uncle's estate could be settled, he had so little cash on hand that he had been obliged to dismiss his own coachman, although he could hardly get along without the household servants, especially Alice. She would have to go soon enough, he told himself, but a glance at Felicia told him that the sacrifice would be worthwhile. Sometimes he wondered why it was necessary to wed a lady in order to bed her, but that was the way of the world, and meanwhile there were willing wenches in it. A shapeless shadow flitted across the window as they approached the house, one of the ladies on each of his arms, and the look of it somehow sickened him, but they did not seem to have noticed. He opened his mouth to begin again his arguments about the foolish recklessness of the business they were embarked upon, but thought better of it. He had already decided to show them, and that was why he was here. The old woman was simply a sensation seeker, and it would be just as happy to discover that the spiritualist was a fraud. But Felicia was something of a fanatic on the subject, and that would never do. Still, this night's work should settle that, and another night's work after the wedding would provide her with a new interest in life. Determined to take matters in his own hand, Calendar rapped on the door with a gloved fist. While he waited impatiently, Felicia reached past him and pulled on a narrow, rattling chain that he had never noticed. "The bell," she explained. "He may not hear you knocking from upstairs." "No lights upstairs," said Calendar. "Besides, I saw someone move down here, unless it was one of his confederates." "Mr. Newcastle has no need of confederates, nor has he any need of light." Aunt Penelope, thrilled into temporary silence by her approach to the land that lies beyond death, gave a little squeal when the door in front of them abruptly opened. A tall man stood on the threshold with a silver candlestick in his hand, a single flame illuminating a lean, pale face that was shadowed by black hair and a long moustache. Calendar was startled for a moment by the scar, then dismissed it as an effective theatrical touch, and spent most of the next few minutes trying to decide if it was real. The man, who was quite clearly a Newcastle, rather than a servant, stepped back silently and ushered them into an empty hall with a dusty carpet of no determinable pattern. At the end of the hallway was a double door, and beyond that a room which seemed unnaturally dark, even after their host had brightened it with his lone candle. Calendar saw that both the floor and the ceiling had been painted black, and that black velvet draperies completely covered the walls. A small round table sat there, surrounded by 4 high-backed wooden chairs. All of them appeared to be made of ebony. The medium set his candlestick in the centre of the table. That is certainly a vibe. And stood quietly waiting for his visitors to follow him into the gloomy chamber. His clothing was black as Calendar's mourning, so that only his white face and hands were distinctly visible, apparently floating disembodied in the air. When the ladies entered with their dark cloaks and bonnets, the effect was much the same, and Calendar had no reason to believe that he looked any different. The illusion was disconcerting. The 2 women sat down across from one another, but Mr. Reginald Calendar remained on his feet, squinting into the shadows where Sebastian Newcastle's eyes were hidden. He expected the spiritualist to flinch before his penetrating stare, but the fellow was imperturbable, and ultimately it was Calendar who turned away in what he told himself was pure disdain. A mounting sense of irritation caused him to break the silence at last. "Well, bring on your spooks, sir, or must we pay you for them first?" "Reginald!" Felicia's voice was harsher than he had ever heard it sound, and before he knew what had happened he was seated beside her, feeling very much like a chastened schoolboy, and wondering for the first time if married life might be something less than pleasant. Aunt Penelope suppressed a nervous giggle. Calendar had a deep desire to lash out at someone, but had difficulty deciding who it should be. Sebastian Newcastle sat down across the table from him. "There will be no charge for your visit, Mr. Calendar, since I do not expect you to enjoy it." "I don't know, I've always enjoyed conjuring tricks, but you won't find me as easy to fool as some of your visitors." "Miss Lamb and her aunt are hardly fools, Mr. Calendar, even if they do seek to be still wiser than they are. And have you never wondered what waits beyond the grave?" "We have churches to tell us that, and not for money." "Your churches are far richer than I am, and likely to remain so." "Well, Mr. Newcastle, you'll have a chance to change that tonight. Here's 10 guineas. Calendar reached into his waistcoat pocket and placed the money on the table. He could ill afford to lose it. "If I see anything here that I cannot explain, that belongs to you." He pointed emphatically to the cash and noticed to his amazement that it was gone. "By God," he said, "these are very materialistic spirits, sir." "You will find that I have returned the money to your pockets, Mr. Calendar." Calendar felt for the money and almost forgot himself enough to curse. "Is it there?" said Aunt Penelope. "I think Reginald's face answers that question for him," observed Felicia coldly. "Really, Reginald, we have not come here to insult our host, but to learn from him. Do be quiet, if only to please me. Mr. Newcastle has promised to summon my parents tonight." "Your parents were killed in a railway accident 12 years ago, Felicia, and if your father had not been one of the chief stockholders in that railway, this man would have no interest in him or in you." "He will certainly have no interest if you will not give him the peace he needs to pierce the veil." Calendar reminded himself again that he determined to hold his tongue, and realised ruefully that he should have done so. Even Aunt Penelope had said almost nothing. "Silence is an aid to concentration," Newcastle said evenly. Calendar nodded almost imperceptibly, and was delighted to find himself rewarded at once when Felicia took his hand. He was more than a little startled, though, when Aunt Penelope did the same, and then he surmised that this was common behaviour at a séance. Still, it took all his willpower to refrain from comment when he saw his fiancée's delicate fingers in the pale clutch of the man with the dark eyes. The 4 of them sat quietly in the black room, Calendar never taking his eyes from the medium, who gradually sank back into his chair and allowed his head to slump forward. He looked like an old man dozing after a heavy dinner, reminding Calendar of his Uncle William. After a few minutes the atmosphere grew chilly, and Calendar was almost convinced that he could feel a damp breeze waft past him. Still, it was enough to make him look around uncomfortably, taking his eyes off the medium just long enough for something strange to happen. For a moment, Calendar thought the man might be on fire. Vague tendrils of smoke seemed to be rising from his head, but they looked more like mist than smoke, and they wove patterns in the air that did not seem natural. Calendar turned to his right and his left, but the 2 women holding his hands were not dismayed, and seemed to be regarding the display with intelligent approval. The medium groaned, and now his head was almost hidden by shifting fingers of mist. He seemed to be dissolving into the darkness. Calendar started involuntarily, and had half risen from his chair when a blast of frigid wind boarded him across the table. The candle flame went out. He felt Felicia's grip on his fingers increase until it was almost painful, and a certain unexpected weakness in his knees compelled him to sink down into a seat again. Nothing was visible except the writhing cloud of mist which seemed to glow with its own faint luminescence. He tried to convince himself that it was some sort of trick with chemicals, but he was not happy looking at it, especially when it began to coalesce into features which were not those of Sebastian Newcastle. It was the face of a woman, its mouth working feebly as if it did not have the strength to speak. A sound came from somewhere that was like whispering or the scurrying of rats. The face shifted and flickered, and sometimes it seemed to be a man with a full beard. Now there were two whispers, one lower than the other, and Calendar began to believe that he could hear what they were saying. It was one word repeated over and over again. Felicia. Calendar knew that his hands were trembling, and he hoped that the woman would not notice. The lights of the glowing mist were gleaming in Felicia's eyes as she leaned forward across the table, and Calendar was dismayed by the eagerness with which she seemed to welcome this horror, whether it was fraudulent or not. He hoped it was an illusion, for he had no wish to think it real, yet it infuriated him to realise that he could be frightened by a humbug. He closed his eyes, but the sound of the wavering, whispering voices was even more disturbing when he was blind to their source. He would have preferred to leave. "Felicia," whispered the sibilant chorus. "Beware, daughter. Beware of false friends. There is one here whom you must not trust." "Who is it?" asked Felicia breathlessly. She and her aunt stared into the shifting mist. "It is the man," the voices cried. "Which man?" "The man who tells you these damned lies," shouted Calendar. He pushed back his chair and pulled his hands free while the floating faces burst into brilliant light and disappeared into impenetrable darkness. He fumbled for a match while Aunt Penelope screamed. Calendar struck a light on the side of the table and applied it at once to the candle. The two women stood behind him, clutched in one another's arms, and an indistinct figure sat slumped in the medium's chair. Calendar waited for another trick, fearful that the flame would be extinguished again, but there was only silence in the black room. The body of Sebastian Newcastle was ominously still. "Is he dead?" asked Aunt Penelope. "I hope so," muttered Calendar. He walked briskly to the figure in the chair and grasped it roughly by the hair to pull its hanging head up into the light. The features that rose up to meet him were those of Uncle William. The waxy eyelids were closed, but the full lips moved. "Dead," said Uncle William. Aunt Penelope gasped and swayed in the arms of her niece, who hurried the fainting woman from the room with a brisk efficiency, while Calendar stood as if paralysed and stared into the face of a familiar corpse. His fingers slipped slowly from its head, and its lips twisted themselves into a comfortable grin. When the eyes opened, they were William Calendar's. He might have been alive again. "Surprised, are you, my boy? Well, there will be more surprises in store for you soon. Wait till you talk to old Frobisher tomorrow about my will." Ha ha ha. Calendar was hardly listening, although he would have cause to remember those words soon enough. Whatever it was in the chair seemed so relaxed and genial that it convinced him more than an army of phantoms could have done. "Is it really you?" he asked. "Of course it's me. Back from the dead? Not so far to come, really. It takes time to travel on, you know, especially for someone like me, who's not what you could call spiritually advanced. But this Newcastle's a very clever fellow, and he's helping me along. Don't trifle with him, my boy." Calendar had almost forgotten that he was speaking to a ghost. Everything was very natural and full of the ordinary irritations of talking with his uncle. "The man is a threat to Felicia," insisted the irate nephew. "Even the spirits of her parents told her so." "Oh, no, my dear boy, they were talking about you." "Me? Why should she beware of me?" "You're not so spiritually advanced yourself, are you, Reginald? Much too interested in the pleasures of the flesh, of course. And very bad-tempered on top of it. And possessive, of course. I'm sure you'd make a poor girl miserable. I'm sorry to say you're really no more than a fortune hunter. You really should be more careful. Look." Uncle William pointed to the door, and Reginald Calendar turned to find Felicia standing there. Evidently she had heard everything. Calendar felt a hot flush roar up his throat as he whirled to confront his uncle, but the figure in the chair was Sebastian Newcastle, smiling with his sharp teeth and holding a pack of cards in one hand. "Will you have your fortune told before you go, Mr. Calendar?" "No." "Then I bid you a good evening." And with that the medium glided out of the chair and through the black velvet curtains that covered the walls. Calendar hurried to his fiancée's side. "Did you see him? Did you see Uncle William?" Felicia nodded. "And so did Aunt Penelope. I had to help her out of the carriage, but she swears she never had such a stimulating evening in her life." "Did you hear what he said?" "Only what Mr. Newcastle said to you, and since he is retired, I believe we should follow his example." Calendar wondered for the first time, but not the last, if it was possible that she was mocking him. Yet he was confused enough to take her arm and walk halfway down the hall with her before he pulled away. "He's a fraud, I tell you, and I can prove it. He hurried back into the black room, devoid of a strategy, but determined to redeem himself. He glared around at emptiness and then rushed to a wall. All tricks, he told himself. The curtains! He grasped 2 fistfuls of midnight velvet and pulled them apart, peering fiercely through them, ready for almost any sight, but the one that confronted him. There was no machinery, no hidden door. There was not even a wall. There was only the night, an ebony void where clouds of yellow fog obscured the stars. Calendar swayed, keeping his feet only because he held onto the curtains. For a moment he felt like a man lying on his back and staring up at the sky. His head reeled. Then he turned on his heel and walked stiffly out of the house into the carriage where the women waited. I'm going to have a drink every chapter, because otherwise I'll forget to have a drink. Right. 4. The inheritance. Calendar would have wasted no time in visiting his uncle's solicitor in any case, but the ghostly warning he had received was so alarming that he was awake and dressed and at the offices of Frobisher and Jarndyce, long before the hour of noon. He tried to convince himself that what he'd seen had been a dream or a trick, or perhaps the result of mesmerism, which purportedly had the power to make a man see anything. But certainly the previous evening's entertainment was enough to make an heir curious about the terms of the will that would determine his future. Rising early proved to be a fruitless gesture, however, since Calendar was not expected until afternoon, and Clarence Frobisher had chosen to spend the morning in Chancery. A clerk had left the heir apparent to cool his heels in Frobisher's dusty chambers with no company and no entertainment except a shelf of leather-bound law books. More than once, Calendar toyed with the idea of nipping out for a quick one, but missing his man would have been intolerable. In truth to tell, he had an almost superstitious conviction that fortune would favour him if he remained sober until the momentous meeting had been concluded. Nothing prevented him from dozing, however, and his brain was as foggy as the streets of London when he opened one eye suspiciously. He discovered the solicitor making his stately entrance, marred only by a cough, which may have been intended to wake his client. Clarence Frobisher, as Calendar had occasion to observe before, was a man with a very dry manner, and an equally wet face. His voice was rasping and sandy, his attitude was distant and aloof, but his brow was perpetually dabbled with perspiration, his rheumy eyes seeming always on the verge of tears, and a soiled handkerchief was never far from his dripping nose. Blech. Calendar had never liked Frobisher, but he was prepared to overlook the solicitor's personal shortcomings in exchange for the speedy delivery of Uncle William's estate. Frobisher nodded and adjusted his rusty black suit as he lowered himself into an old horsehair chair behind his heavy mahogany desk. Its surface littered with papers and broken bits of sealing wax. He glanced at a document, reached for a quill pen, then seemed to recollect himself and peered out at Calendar over his gold eyeglasses.
Mr. Calendar?
I've come about my Uncle William's estate.
Well, sir, you are prompt. More than prompt, I might say.
There is no difficulty with the will, I hope?
Difficulty?
No changes?
Changes? Certainly not.
Reginald Calendar, now a man of property, allowed himself the luxury of a sigh. Yet something continued to nag at him. Perhaps it was the expression on Frobisher's moist lips. Moist. Had it been anyone else, he would have suspected the man was smiling. And I am still the sole heir?
Sole heir? Yes, in a matter of speaking. There are other considerations, my fee for one.
Well, said Calendar expansively, I hope you will be handsomely paid.
I have seen to that. Your uncle settled with me when the will was drawn.
Nothing else, then?
The funeral arrangements were the first order of business, according to your uncle's orders. He wished no expense to be spared. There is a substantial bill for Menstruation and sum, but this is a pittance compared to the cost of the marble mausoleum.
Calendar, who had not even considered this, felt thousands slipping through his fingers. But of course the estate is large enough to pay for this, he'd suggested nervously.
Precisely.
And there is nothing else?
Nothing.
Something in this last exchange made Calendar feel hollow inside. He could not shake off the feeling that Frobisher was toying with him. He watched the handkerchief working and wondered if the solicitor was laughing behind it. When I say nothing else, Calendar began, I mean no other claims against my uncle's fortune.
Precisely.
And when you say the estate is precisely large enough?
I am speaking as plainly as I can, Mr. Calendar.
Frobisher blew his nose and made a choking, wheezing sound. Then be plainer still, or be damned, sir. How much is left for me? Speak. Frobisher pocketed his handkerchief and picked up a sheet of paper. He glanced at it, blinked, and handed it to Calendar.
What is left for you, he said,
and paused to clear his throat.
Is precisely nothing.
Calendar looked at the desk, studying the grain of the wood. He found the pattern oddly intriguing. It held his attention totally for some time. Long enough, in fact, for the solicitor to become somewhat alarmed.
Mr. Calendar?
What?
A glass of port, perhaps.
Calendar laughed for an instant and watched as the solicitor stepped to a sideboard and poured the wine. It struck him as really very decent of the old boy. He could hardly think of anything else except that he would be grateful for the drink, and when he gulped it down, it did restore him to some semblance of sanity. Then all at once his thoughts were racing so fast that he was almost dizzy. "Nothing left?" he asked. "What became of it all?"
"He spent it."
"All of it? It was worth a bloody fortune."
"So he was, Mr. Calendar. Not even the bad investments he made in India could have made a pauper of him. What should I say of you? There's still some accounting to be made in regard to that, but I doubt if you will see enough from the colonies to stand you a good dinner."
"And the rest of it?"
"As I have said, it is more common than you might suppose for an elderly man of affairs to awake one day and realize that his hours with us are numbered, and that the money he has struggled to accumulate has brought him very little in the way of pleasure. Faced with the choice of delighting you or delighting himself, your uncle unhesitatingly decided on the latter course. You might say that he went out in a blaze of glory. Women, of course, and quite a bit of gambling as well. I suppose, if he had won, he might have been obliged to leave you something."
"But to have spent so much," Calendar began.
"He became quite a generous man in his last days. Quite a bit was spent on diamonds, and I personally arranged a gift of a handsome residence to one of his favourite mistresses. He also gave substantial sums to the household servants, the only stipulation being that they remain in service until the day after he was laid to rest. There was a man named Booth, and a housemaid, I think her name was Alice. They should be gone by now."
Calendar thought back to the empty house, which he had hardly noticed in his eagerness to visit Frobisher and Jarndyce. "Should have whipped her harder," he muttered.
"I beg your pardon?"
"Nothing. At least there's still the house."
"Mortgaged to the hilt, I'm afraid. I think he meant for you to have it, but he surprised his doctors and himself by living longer than he anticipated, and his funds were very low. Still, you might realize something if you can sell it before the inevitable foreclosure, and there might be a bit left from the Indian disaster. I believe your uncle's representative is on a ship bound for England now, Mr. Nigel Stone."
"Cousin Nigel? That idiot? No wonder everything was lost." Frobisher consulted another document.
"I understand that you were offered the post, but preferred to remain in London at your uncle's expense. Is my information incorrect?"
Calendar pushed himself up from his chair and strode towards the door. He threw it open, then turned for a parting shot. "Of course I'll contest the will," he said.
"And I would be happy to represent you, but I do advise against it, since you are in fact the sole beneficiary. The problem is that the whole estate was spent before your turn came. To spend what little you have left on legal fees would be ill-advised."
"I suppose that advice is free, is it?" Calendar looked around desperately. "I believe the old bastard did this just to spite me."
"I would hardly put it as bluntly as that," suggested Frobisher. "Mr. Calendar, you've forgotten your stick."
Calendar whirred in the doorway and stormed back into the room to retrieve his ebony walking stick. He was tempted to smash it across Frobisher's desk, but managed to stop himself in time with the realization he could hardly afford to replace it. "Ah, hi, Jim." Reginald Calendar retreated to the nearest public house and drank 3 glasses of neat gin in quick succession, but even that was not enough to keep his hand from trembling. He left the place and began to walk towards the house where Sally lived, trusting that the time the journey took would enable him to collect his thoughts. In a sense, Sally Wood was his mistress, although she was hardly fool enough to imagine that he was the only man who shared her favours. It was a considerable source of pride to him, however, to reflect that he was certainly the only one of her lovers who had never been obliged to pay her. She liked him, apparently. It pleased Calendar to believe that it was because he was the more distinguished than most of the men she met at the music hall. Still, it was at least possible that his stature as the nephew of a wealthy and elderly gentleman had something to do with Sally's attitude. Calendar wondered what she would say if she were to learn that he was destitute. Not that he would tell her, of course, but providing her with little presents and even the occasional meal might become a problem very soon. The real difficulty, though, lay with Felicia. The panic with which he contemplated keeping his poverty from her was what drove him on towards Sally's door. Calendar possessed a key to her lodging house, but after ascending the dark stairs he felt it advisable to pause at the door to her room before entering. He listened stealthily, always conscious of the occasion when he had intruded on a scene he would have chosen not to witness, yet there was no sound from inside but a woman's voice humming a snatch of song. Calendar knocked. There was a rustling from within, and then the door opened to reveal Sally, undressed except for a black corset trimmed with red silk. A hairbrush backed with mother of pearl was in her hand.
"Reggie, hello, dear."
Calendar's brief touch of irritation at her use of the detested pet name was soon smothered in the warmth of her embrace. Enveloped in a cloud of perfume, he manoeuvred Sally back across the threshold, and shut the door behind him, then kissed her ravenously while his hands crawled over her exposed flesh. Hi Zoe. Say hi to Andrew for me. Yes, haircut. Badly shaved head, because I got sick of it being too long. Where was I? After a few moments, she pushed him away, gasping and laughing at the same time.
"A girl needs air, you know," she said, "and a lady likes to be spoken to first."
She sent him a smile over her shoulder and then sat down at a dressing table covered in pots of paint and powder. For the time, Calendar was content to lounge against the wall and watch as she brushed her gleaming chestnut hair. Sally was such a contrast to Felicia, ruddy rather than pale, voluptuous rather than slender, and distinctly physical rather than spiritual. It puzzled him that somehow he was not satisfied with Sally, who seemed to offer him everything he wanted. Yet he was convinced, with no proof to speak of that having his way with his fiancée would be a more stimulating experience than anything Sally could provide. It hardly mattered, though. Felicia's fortune in itself was sufficient to make her a much more suitable companion. A glance around the room was sufficient to convince Calendar of that. The cheerful disarray which might be charming in a mistress would be utterly unsuitable in a wife. The floor was dusty, the bed unmade, and every article of furniture was covered with piles of hastily discarded clothing. The general effect would have been the same, he thought, if there had been an explosion in a dressmaker's shop. A pamphlet, half covered by a crumpled sheet, caught his attention. He picked it up and straightened the wrinkled cover, embellished by a crude drawing of a cloaked, skeletal figure looming over a sleeping woman. Bats and gravestones decorated the lurid title, Varney the Vampire, or The Feast of Blood. "Reading Penny Dreadfuls, Sally?"
"A girl gets bored sometimes, and it's a good story."
"It's rubbish."
"That's his maybe, but it's exciting. It's about a gent who's dead, but he comes back at night and drinks people's blood. Sneaks right into her rooms, he does, and drains them dry while they sleep. He bites their throats."
Sally touched her own throat to emphasise the point. Sounds deucedly unpleasant to me. Observed Calendar, flipping through the pages looking for more illustrations.
"And then they turn into vampires themselves after he's done with them."
"He also seems to go around sticking logs into people," said Calendar as he found a particularly lurid drawing.
"Oh no, Reggie, that's what they have to do to kill the vampires, for good and all. Pound a stick of wood right into their hearts, they do."
Sally laid a dramatic hand on her own substantial bosom. "You don't believe this nonsense, do you?"
"I don't know about that, but it's something to think about, isn't it? Besides, I like the way it makes me feel, all goose pimply."
"Then I advise you to light a fire."
"Would you do it, Reggie dear? I've got my hands full."
"Getting ready to go out?"
"In a bit, dear. Why?"
"Because I know a better way to warm you up." Calendar tossed the pamphlet back onto the bed and walked purposefully towards the dressing table. He buried his face in Sally's curly, perfumed hair and clutched one of her breasts on each of his hands. She arched her back, closed her eyes, and smiled as he felt his breath on her face.
"Going to a public for a drain of gin, did you?"
"Anything wrong with that?" asked Calendar as he fumbled with her corset.
"You might have brought some with you."
"Aren't I intoxicating enough?"
"That you are, Reggie. It's wonderful to have a wealthy lover. Makes a girl feel special."
Calendar tore at his cravat. "You'd love me without that, wouldn't you?"
"Of course I would. And I was sorry to hear about your uncle."
She pushed his clumsy hands away and quickly undressed herself. And before long they were on the bed and the forgotten copy of Varney the Vampire crushed beneath their thrashing bodies. (5) The Dead Room. The parade of kings stood still and a common man marched past. He was a guide, dressed in a uniform that made him look like a soldier, and he announced each crowned head of Europe in a hoarse voice that Calendar found increasingly irritating. He was thoroughly sick of the officious little man and his apparently endless procession of wax effigies. His dislike of these soft statues and their false finery had begun before he even entered Madame Tussaud's, when he had been informed that, due to the flammable nature of the exhibits, he would be obliged to throw away the last of his Uncle William's imported cigars. And nothing before or after this affront to Calendar had been calculated to soothe his temper. The expedition to Madame Tussaud's exhibition in Baker Street had begun disastrously when the cab Calendar hired had arrived at Felicia Lamb's residence, only to find her absent. Aunt Penelope, however, had been obtrusively pleasant, coquettishly claiming Calendar as her escort with the explanation that Mr. Newcastle, the medium, had taken Felicia into his coach a quarter of an hour ago. Calendar's initial indignation had rapidly given way to a feeling close to panic. He could not quite suppress the unreasonable fear that his fiancée had been adopted, and that he would never see her again. The journey to the Wax Museum, orchestrated by Aunt Penelope's incessant chatter, had been excruciating. The upshot, which surprised him by irritating him, had been nothing at all. Felicia, eyes downcast demurely as he stood in the gaslit lobby of the Baker Street Bazaar, and she had been holding Sebastian Newcastle's long, thin arm. This apparent intimacy, combined with the anticlimax of it all, left Calendar fuming, and as Aunt Penelope pulled him towards the exhibition, he thought he saw Felicia smile gratefully at her. Apparently Newcastle had paid for all their tickets, and there was nothing that Calendar could reasonably expect her to do about that. Calendar's tour of the Wax Museum had become a nightmare long before he reached the Chamber of Horrors. He hardly noticed the exhibits, and he did not miss a single one of the glances exchanged by his fiancée and Sebastian Newcastle. They seemed to be hanging back deliberately, engaged in private conversation, while Calendar was pushed forward by the pressure of the crowd, by Aunt Penelope, a woman he would willingly have strangled. Calendar's face was hot and his cravat was choking him. Was it possible that Felicia was deliberately snubbing him? He was so intent on the couple behind him that he nearly knocked over the guide when the procession suddenly came to a halt in front of a door barred by a red velvet rope.
"This concludes the tour of the exhibition," announced the little man in the blue uniform. "The general exhibition, that is. But behind me, ladies and gentlemen, behind this rope, behind the door, there stands the Dead Room, or as some would be generous to call it, Madame Tussaud's Chamber of Horrors. Those of you who have purchased tickets for this special display may follow me now, but I caution you this is a room filled with the effigies of evil and engines of extermination. Here are the most notorious murderers and malefactors of history and of the present day, together with the authentic devices of torture and execution, including the very guillotine that killed the King of France. In addition, you will see replicas of the severed heads of the King and his Queen, Marie Antoinette, along with those of such notables as Mr. Robespierre, all of them authentic impressions taken immediately after decapitation by the fair hands of Madame Tussaud when she was but a young girl more than half a century ago. This is not an exhibit for the faint-hearted, ladies and gentlemen, but you have been warned, and those of you who are willing to brave the Dead Room will now please follow me."
Calendar watched in some surprise as the crowd melted away. Whether they were prudent or merely parsimonious, the British public did not seem inclined, at least on this night, to feast on horrors. In fact, there were finally only 4 customers, and they were all of Calendar's party, although of course it was really Aunt Penelope's, a point she emphasised with a little cry of excitement as the portal to the Chamber of Horrors opened to admit her. You find yourself in a dead room. Yeah. You died. The room was dark, deliberately, thought Calendar, and his first impression was of a crowd of men waiting in the shadows. As his eyes became accustomed to the lack of light, he realised that his figures had been grouped like prisoners awaiting for sentence in the dock. And he noticed that there were women scattered among the men. An ancient woman in a grey gown particularly caught his eye. In general, though, they seemed to be a nondescript lot, and only statues anyway.
"So this is the celebrated Dead Room," boomed Calendar,
conscious that Felicia was following him.
"It doesn't look that frightening. I gladly take 100 guineas to spend the night among these frozen fiends." "Sorry, sir," replied the smiling guide. "Dame Rumour offered that reward, not Madame Tussaud, who has no wish for visitors after we close our doors at night at 10 o'clock. The only living human being allowed to spend the night among these figures is Madame Tussaud herself."
"Would you really have done it, Reginald?"
gasped Aunt Penelope, and Calendar was conscious of a certain satisfaction, even though he would have preferred to elicit a response from Felicia. He risked a glance backward and was pleased to see her pale blue eyes upon him.
"Of course the story of a ward is a lie," he said. "There's nothing here to scare a schoolboy. Who are those fellows?"
He gestured with his stick at a pair of shaggy ruffians bedecked in caps and ragged scarves. "Well, sir, you're taking them out of order, but since there are so few of you tonight, I don't suppose it matters. These are Burke and Eyre, ghouls, grave robbers and murderers who stole bodies from a doctor's dissecting lessons, then turned to killing when a supply of fresh corpses ran short. Burke was executed in 1829 on his partner's evidence. They stole dignity from the dead and breath from the living. A most despicable pair and one of our most popular groupings." The story, which reminded Calendar of something in his own past, did not really amuse him.
"Of course this sort of thing is far behind us," he observed. "Now, we provide our medical schools with the specimens they need."
"Yet there are still vermin who will rob the dead," said Sebastian Newcastle. Calendar's hand moved involuntarily towards the pocket of his waistcoat. Yeah, I mean, I've been around the Edinburgh dungeons as well. They're quite cool. Well, I've been a section of the Edinburgh dungeons. Different accent for the tour guide, I imagine. He wondered how much power the medium might possess, then shook off his suspicions together with his memories of the séance. That vision had been the result of hypnotism or fatigue, or perhaps of some drug, but it certainly had nothing to do with the supernatural.
"Surely no man could be so contemptible,"
murmured Felicia, and again Calendar felt a flush of shame. Would they know? He remembered a line from an old play his uncle had dragged him to see about conscience-creating cowards, and he kept his peace. Yet it disturbed him to realise that neither Sebastian Newcastle nor Felicia Lamb had spoken a word to him outside of perfunctory greetings when the subject of rifling corpses had arisen. He looked desperately for a diversion and found one he could hardly have hoped for when Felicia's Aunt Penelope began to scream. His eyes followed her pointing finger and then widened in shock when he saw what she had seen first. It was an old woman in grey, half hidden among the murderers. She rose. Her wrinkled face turned towards the dim gaslight, and her eyes gleamed as a small smile twisted her wizened features. A gigantic shadow rose behind her as she stood, and Calendar stumbled backwards as Aunt Penelope collapsed into his arms. They both would have fallen to the floor, but for the cold, rigid bulk of Mr. Newcastle. Calendar felt Newcastle's hand close on his flailing wrist, and suddenly he was less afraid of a walking effigy than he was of the icy presence behind him. He saw in flashes the cold face of Newcastle, the rigid and contemptuous countenance of Felicia, and the wrinkled features of the old woman that guided towards him. All of them were pale. "Madame Tussaud," said the guide, scuttling back in a broad gesture that was equally composed of bowing and cringes. "I didn't expect you here." "You all but announced me, Joseph. And where else would a crone like me find our friends, except among the dead? You may leave early tonight, Joseph. I will be hostess to our guests. There is one among them who interests me." Joseph virtually fled, and Calendar whipped his head around from the disappearing form, expecting to find the eyes of the old waxworker focused on him. But he saw at once that Madame Tussaud was blinking intently at Sebastian Newcastle. "Have we not met, sir?" "I hardly think I could have encountered Madame without remembering her." "You are gracious, but are you truthful?" Madame Tussaud's English, however fluent, still betrayed her French upbringing, and there was something foreign in Newcastle's speech as well, but Calendar could not identify it. "You have a memorable face, I think," said the old woman. "Now you flatter me," said Newcastle. "That was hardly my intention, but your scar, if I may be so blunt, is all but unforgettable." "I apologize if it affronts you." "No, sir, it is I who should beg your pardon, but I think I remember you. One who has lived 87 years, as I have, I've seen much, and it seems to me that I recollect a man with a face like yours, or at least talk of him. But that was many years ago, and that man could hardly have been you." Ominous, yeah. Sebastian Newcastle contented himself with a bow. The dead room was so dark and their faces so indistinct that Calendar could hardly tell what the two of them were thinking. More than anything, he was aware of the way Felicia's eyes shifted back and forth between the two. What really shocked him, though, was the sudden recovery of Aunt Penelope, who pulled herself out of his arms and demanded to know whether the two of them were acquainted or not. "There were stories in Paris when the revolution raged," said Madame Tussaud, "about a magician, one who had found a way to keep himself alive forever." "No doubt there were many such stories in a time of turmoil," said Newcastle. "Of course," agreed Madame Tussaud. "And the man I speak of would have been older than I am by now. This was more than 50 years ago. It can be no more than a coincidence." "Men say that there are such things," said Newcastle. "He was a Spaniard," said Madame Tussaud, "and I would have given much to model him in wax. But that is all behind us now. Will you look at my relics of the Revolution? I paid dearly for them." "How so?" asked Felicia. Fascinated by the exchange between the others, Calendar had almost forgotten her. "With the blood on my hands, young lady, and with the memories that will last as long as this old body holds them. I was apprenticed to my uncle, and the raiders of the Revolution ordered me to make impressions in wax of heads fresh from the basket of the executioner. Fresh from the blade of that." Madame Tussaud thrust her arm out dramatically. Her trembling finger pointed towards a looming silhouette of wooden beams and ropes. Even in the dim light, the slanted steel blade at the top gleamed dully. "The guillotine!" gasped Aunt Penelope. Excuse me. She swayed towards it slowly, like a woman in a trance, and stared up at the sharp edge, as if she expected it to shudder down and smash into its base at her approach. She lowered her eyes gradually, then bent over to examine the displays at the foot of the guillotine. She looked at Calendar like a housekeeper examining the choice cuts in a butcher's shop. The waxy heads stared up reproachfully, their indignation threefold. Bad enough to have been cut off, worse yet to have been captured in wax, but unsupportable to be displayed to gawkers at a penny apiece. Aunt Penelope seemed to wilt under their gaze. She made a strange sound. "I don't feel well at all," she said. I think I should go home." "We should all go," said Calendar. No, my boy, I wouldn't think of it. Mr. Newcastle is Madame Tussaud's old friend. You take me, and let the others stay." Aunt Penelope began to sway towards Calendar's arms again, a habit which was becoming increasingly annoying. "It's very good of you, Reginald," added Felicia with sweet finality. "I shall be quite safe here, Mr. Newcastle." With Mr. Newcastle. Calendar was sorely tempted to disagree, but he sensed the futility of argument. There was very little choice for anyone who wanted to look like a gentleman except to carry the old fool out and find her a cab. He tried to maintain his composure while he backed clumsily out of the dead room, and the three who stayed behind smiled at him. He might not have succeeded if he had seen Aunt Penelope winking at her niece. Evidently age brings wisdom even to a woman such as she, Newcastle remarked.
She's such a dear, really, even if she does rattle on sometimes. She knew how much I wanted to remain a little longer, and Reginald would have been bound to cause a scene of some sort. Then you wish to see more of my handiwork?
Asked Madame Tussaud.
No, Felicia replied at once. I mean, yes, of course, but I really wanted to hear more about the gentleman you spoke of, the one who was so like Mr. Newcastle.
He might have been an ancestor, perhaps, suggested the man with the scar.
And are such wounds as these passed on from father to son?
Asked the old woman. She reached up and caressed Newcastle's cheek.
I could wish to make a model of such a face.
For your dead room, madame? Newcastle asked.
Mr. Newcastle is no stranger to the dead, Felicia said. He speaks to them. He is a spiritualist.
She felt that she had to say something, even though a mixture of common courtesy and uncommon fear kept her from posing the question she longed to ask. There was some sort of understanding between these two, and she was impatient to share it.
This gentleman from Paris, she said
at last.
Do you remember his name?
He was a Spanish nobleman, Don Sebastian. Can you help me, Mr. Newcastle? I believe I can. Of course, I have made such a study of such things. His name was Don Sebastian de Villanueva. But I also recall that any claim he had to immortality was false. Was he not reported dead? The old woman thought for a moment.
A girl was found to have been quite out of her wits, who said she saw him shatter like glass, or vanish in a puff of smoke, or some such thing, so I suppose he is dead. Then again, a master of the black arts might be capable of such tricks, if he found it convenient to disappear for a time.
Quite so, said Sebastian Newcastle, and Felicia Lamb shivered. From somewhere nearby she heard the tolling of a bell.
The hour grows late, said Madame Tussaud, and I am an old woman. I must ask you to leave me alone among my friends.
Indeed, Miss Lamb, said Newcastle. He drew a silver watch from his waistcoat and glanced at its face. The watch was shaped like a skull.
You've got a vibe there, haven't you, mate?
Yeah. The time is late. The museum is closed, and a man in my position must never be accused of keeping a young lady out until an indecent hour. We must take our leave. Good night, madame. The waxworker curtsied, and the medium bowed, and Felicia felt herself being carried from the dead room. But as soon as she was through the door, Newcastle paused. Please, wait here. I must return for a few seconds. I neglected to pay our guide for the tour. Madame Tussaud was waiting for him in the shadows by the guillotine.
Don Sebastian, she said.
Madame, he replied, I trust you to keep my secret.
You can hardly expect to keep it much longer from that girl, you know.
It matters little. She will become a disciple. She wishes it.
And has she said as much?
She need not speak for me to know.
And have you many such disciples after half a century in London?
None.
Hello, Shay.
None, said Don Sebastian. He gazed at the wax figures around him. But I have my dead, like you, and also those who will pay to see them. A small income, but my needs are simple.
I think you need something that you cannot buy with gold, do you not?
Gold will buy more than you think sometimes. When it will not, I feed as lightly as I can, so that my prey knows nothing more than a few days of weakness, soon forgotten. And I never drink from the same fountain twice. I rarely forget myself, although enough to dine too heavily. And if I do, well, there is a remedy for that.
A physic made of wood, perhaps.
You are wise, madame. The old woman shuffled over to a rocking chair that sat in the corner.
If 87 years have not made me wise, sir, then what can I hope for?
I had forgotten myself, madame. Twice I've been driven back into the world of spirits, and so my years on earth have been scarcely more than yours.
And did you never find peace?
Once, when an ancient world came to an end, its gods took me to their paradise. But after some centuries, a spell of my own devising drew me back to earth again, to your Paris. And since I know how many less pleasant realms there are where spirits dwell, I am content to remain here. The old woman settled back in her chair.
Then I wish you good night, sir, and bon voyage.
I have forgotten one thing, said Don Sebastian. He raised his arm, and a shower of golden guineas streamed from his empty hand into the basket that contained the wax remains of Marie Antoinette. Very prettily done, sir, said Madame Tussaud, but I hope you have not damaged that head. I would not dream of such a thing, madame. You are an artist. Huh. Imagine flirting with fucking Madame Tussaud. How lad. Ay, caramba. 6. A visitor from India. Reginald Calendar sat at his uncle's study with the last bottle of his uncle's brandy on the desk in front of him. He still thought of what little was left here as his uncle's, since he himself had inherited nothing, and most of what remained in the house was gone now, sold to a furniture dealer to raise a bit of ready money. Calendar had no head for business, just enough to know that he'd been cheated, but he hardly cared any more. The labourer who came to loot the house had left him his bed and the trappings of this one room where he had hidden while he gutted his birthright. He had no idea what time it was. I think velvet curtains kept out the sun, and he had already pawned his uncle's watch along with everything else pilfered from the coffin. His crime, if it was one, had brought him discouragingly little. He poured himself another drink. The glass was dirty and the bottle was dusty from its sleep in the cellar. He wondered how such things could be cleaned. This, along with such mysteries as the cooking of food or the washing of clothes, were as enigmatic to him as the secret of what lay beyond the grave. He could only smoke and swear and drink and dream, but even two of these required money he did not possess. And his dreams, infuriatingly enough, were of Sally Wood. He cursed himself for this. Now, if ever, his self-interest demanded that he devote himself to dancing attendance upon Felicia Lamb, who clearly held his fate in her small hands. Yet it was Sally's heavy-lidded and full-lipped face that rose before him in the gloom, offering him not so much her beauty, and certainly not her love, but rather the sense of power that surged through him when he held her moaning his arms. She could make him feel like a man again, and not the quivering, drink-soaked wretch he was becoming while he watched his fiancée and his fortune slip away. Still, to see her might be to risk everything. Better to have another drink instead. His trembling hand nearly dropped the bottle when he heard a heavy pounding from somewhere in the house. He sat frozen in his chair, baffled and suspicious, until the sound came again, and he realised it was someone knocking loudly on the front door. He attempted to ignore it, but the visitor was so insistent that Calendar finally dragged himself to his unsteady feet and went out into the hall. Stripped of its furnishings, the empty house reminded him of Sebastian Newcastle's, and it was the scarred and sinister medium that Calendar half expected to greet on the doorstep. Instead, it was a stranger, a beefy, red-faced man with greying hair and clothing that was not only a decade out of fashion, but seemed to have been cut to suit a man slimmer by several stone. He carried a small travelling bag in his left hand, and looked ready to knock again with his right hand, when Calendar pulled open the heavy oak door. The two men peered at each other through a foggy grave that Calendar dimly recognised as dusk, and at last the stranger spoke. "Reggie?" Calendar, who was at least still sober enough to know his own name, did not find this an edifying remark. "I know who I am, damn your eyes, but who in blazes are you?" "Don't you know me?" "I've said as much, blast you, go away." The man in the fog looked genuinely hurt. "But it's your cousin, Nigel Stone." Calendar swayed in the doorway and blinked at his visitor. "Stone? From India?" "That's right, and home at last. How's Uncle William?" "Dead." "Dead? Oh dear, sorry." "Yes," said Calendar, "you'd better come in." Calendar swayed in the doorway and stepped unsteadily back inside. His cousin followed him into what Calendar now realised was almost impenetrable blackness. Nigel Stone paused for a minute, trying to get his bearings. "My dear fellow, the place has been stripped bare." Yes, it was the servants." "Servants?" "Yes, servants. While I was at the funeral, they and their confederates stole all they could and carted it away." "Good Lord! Beastly things, servants. Some of the brown fellows where I was would drop you blind if you didn't keep an eye on them. A blind eye, eh? Almost a joke. Not funny to me, cousin." No, of course not. Sorry. "You'd better follow me into the study. This way." The first thing Stone saw in the room was a brandy bottle flanked by two candles stuck in their own grease to the surface of a massive desk. Calendar sat down in a chair behind it and picked up his glass. In his haste to get his own seat, he neglected the courtesy of offering one to his cousin. "Tell me, Cousin Nigel, how is business in India?" "Not so good, I'm afraid, and that's why Uncle William summoned me." "Oh, just how bad is it?" "Bloody damned bad, if you want to know, my dear fellow. Haven't a farthing." "Nothing left at all?" asked Calendar. His eyes glistened in the candlelight as he drained his glass. "Oh, there's a few boxes of textiles that I had shipped back with me. They should be here in the morning, but that was all I could save. It took the last penny to pay my passage home. No, I'm a liar. I still have £1/4. See?" "You idiot!" Calendar leapt out of his chair and lunged across the desk. He grasped Stone by the collar and hauled him forward, snuffing out a candle and sending the bottle smashing to the floor. Stone was too startled to do more than grunt at first, but when his cousin began to slam him against the desk, the older man broke free and pushed his drunk assailant across the room. Calendar fell to the floor and lay there sobbing with both arms crossed over his face. His cousin stood leaning on the desk, breathing heavily and wishing desperately for a drink from the broken bottle. "Empty anyway," he muttered. Look here. Reggie, are you all right?" He moved hesitantly towards the quivering foam on the carpet.
"It wasn't my fault, really. It's conditions. You don't know what it's like there.
Rebellion, robberies and murder. The whole country's filled with badmen and fanatics. I was lucky to escape with my life."
Calendar sat up so suddenly that his cousin stared back.
"What is your life to me? Well, it's money that I need."
"Really? What do you mean, old fellow? You must be rolling in the stuff. You're his heir, ain't you? I'm sure they didn't leave me anything after all I've lost."
Calendar looked at Stone oddly.
"What? His heir? Yes, of course I'm his heir," he laughed harshly. "But the money isn't here yet. It's all tied up with those damned lawyers, and it may be weeks before I see any of it. You can see what a state I'm in."
God, Reginald just can't tell the truth to anybody, can he? "You really don't look well, my dear fellow," said Stone, helping Calendar back to his chair. "I'm sorry to hear all this, you know. Bit of trouble for both of us. I was really hoping, well, I might be able to stay here for a while, just until I could get myself back on my feet, as it were. I can lend you £1/4."
The two cousins laughed together, Stone with genuine mirth, Calendar with a wheezing bitterness that ended with an offer of sorts.
"I suppose you can stay, cousin, if you're willing to rough it."
"Rough it? I've done nothing else for 10 years. We'll do fine together, eh? And back up, it's only a matter of days."
"Days?" Calendar asked sharply. "What day is this? What is the time?"
"It's Thursday, isn't it? And the last clock I passed said just after 6, as near I could see through this damned fog."
"Thursday at 6? Damn, I'm to dine with my fiancée in an hour."
"Your fiancée? Well, you are a fortunate fellow, and to think that I should find you in such a state."
Stone paused and subjected his cousin to careful scrutiny.
"You know, old fellow, you're really in no condition to meet a lady or even a constable. You need a wash and a shave at least."
"Shave?" barked Calendar. "With this hand, I might as well cut my throat and be done with it."
The fingers he held before Stone's face were visibly trembling. "Tremens there, lad.
I see, a chair to the shakes. Well, we'll have to do something about that. I think we should do a bit of barbering, and I have a razor right here in my bag. You have some water and a log for the fire? We must cheer you up, cuz. I mean to dance at your wedding."
"There is a wedding?"
"What? Something wrong?"
"Much. I'm half afraid I'm losing her."
"That damned spiritualist." "Eh? Someone to lure her away from you? I can't have that."
"It hasn't come to that, I think," said Calendar. "At least not yet. But he has some kind of a hold on her, filling her head with stories of spooks and spirits and other worlds. I don't know how to fight it, but I feel he's changing her." Not far from the truth there, yeah, mate. Yeah. Nigel Stone's face was suddenly grimmer than Calendar had imagined it could be.
"That's a bad business," Stone said. "Very bad, fooling about with spirits."
"What would you know about it?" sneered Calendar.
"I didn't spend 10 years in India for nothing, cuz. I may not have made any money, but at least I learned a thing or two. The whole country is rife with superstition, and what might be more than superstition. Men go mad believing in ghosts and demons there. They kill each other and kill themselves, and some fall under spells that are unspeakable."
"Rubbish."
"And I tell you it's not rubbish. These things can happen, cuz, and even if they don't, just thinking about them can do the worst sort of harm to body and soul. We must do something for this girl before it's too late."
"You do it then," said Calendar. "She only laughs at me when I try."
He paused and contemplated Stone with new interest.
"You look like you could do with a good dinner."
"I could indeed."
"Then come along with me tonight, will you? See if you can scare this nonsense out of Felicia before it injures her. I always end up trapped with her accursed aunt anyway."
Has she an aunt?"
"Yes, a spinster about your age, cousin." "If you ship it, you're right to." "But don't even think of it. No man could bear her. You stick to the niece. And as for now, do you remember where Uncle William's wine cellar is?"
"Downstairs somewhere, isn't it?"
"That's the idea. Fetch us a bottle of port, will you? Then it will be enough for the fire, and the water, and the razor, don't you think?" As you say. Nigel Stone hesitated for a moment at the thought of the wine, since Calendar clearly had no need of it, but decided he could stand a drop himself, and this was justification enough for a descent into the cellar. With one backward glance, he started out on his first task as the unpaid valet of the impoverished cousin he hoped would soon be a rich relative. In the midst of what might have been a pleasant dinner, Stone tried to convince himself that the drop he had shared with his cousin really could not have made much difference. For Reginald Calendar, helping himself to every decanter in sight, was as drunk as the lord he undoubtedly wished himself to be, and his increasingly erratic behaviour interfered at least with Stone's delight in the food, the drink, and the company. Stone found the girl, Felicia Lamb, as pretty as a picture, but not much more animated. Her Aunt Penelope, however, was a lively, bird-like little woman, who not only kept his plate and his glass filled, but had the courtesy, if not the good taste, to hang on his every word. If you ship it, you're right to. For a man long cut off from polite society, such a dinner party was a positive delight, and the luxury of her surroundings fulfilled the hopes that he had held for his Uncle William's house. Stone grew expansive, but he also remembered his promise to his cousin. I understand you take an interest in spiritualism, he said to Felicia. I do, she replied evenly. Did it never occur to you that it might be dangerous? Dangerous? You portray your kinship with Mr. Calendar, sir. I refuse to accept the idea that my search for wisdom is a threat to me. No, you could be right, I suppose. I wouldn't want to contradict a lady, but some things I saw in India would be enough to make a man cautious, or even a woman.
Do tell us about it, Mr. Stone, purred Aunt Penelope. I'm sure it's fascinating.
Yes, interrupted Calendar, and informative too. You listen to this, Felicia. His fiancée stiffened noticeably, while he clumsily poured himself another brandy, spilling as much on the tablecloth as he did into his glass. Well, Stone began uncomfortably, I don't want to make too much of this. Some of what goes on there is just tomfoolery, I reckon, like the fellows who send ropes in the air and climb up them. No harm in that unless the rope breaks, eh? He laughed, but only Auntie Penelope joined in. I think it's just a trick anyway. What I mean to say is that some of them start out like that and then go on to do things that might hurt them badly. They think some of their gods or spirits are watching over them, so they feel free to walk on burning coals or lie down on beds of iron spikes. I've seen it, and they seem to be unharmed too, but what if something went wrong, eh? What if the spirits weren't there when the fellow decided to take a nap? What then? I'm sure I'm not interested in spikes, Mr. Stone, Felicia said. No, my dear young lady, I'm sure you're not, but neither were those chaps once upon a time. Do you see what I'm driving at? Nobody's born thinking of such things, but they're led into them by degrees. The slippery slope to fakerism. He's right, Felicia, said Calendar. His speech was slurred, and she did not deign to reply.
Then these things really are true, said Aunt Penelope.
Damned if I know. Oh, pardon me, my point is, it doesn't really matter if they're true or not as long as people believe in. Take the thugs, for instance.
Thugs?
Asked Aunt Penelope.
Are they some sort of monster?
They're only men, but I suppose you could call them monsters too. They're a cult of murderers, men, women and children. Whole families of them, whole villages, maybe even whole cities, all mad from believing in the spirits of the dead and some goddess of the dead that wants them to kill. They prey on travellers. Wiped out a whole caravan. I would have been on if I hadn't been ill, just as if the earth had swallowed them up. Lord Bentinck hanged a lot of these thugs, I've heard, but there are more, you may be sure of it. And that's what thinking too much about the dead can do. I only wish to learn the secrets of the dead, said Felicia, not add to their number. The dead know nothing, roared Calendar. Learn from me. Life. Really, Reginald, Felicia said coolly. Well, what shall I learn by example? Example? What's the dead's example? Lie down and die yourself, I suppose. Calendar, drunken and angry, was halfway up from his seat when Aunt Penelope tactfully interrupted. Please, Mr. Calendar, let's hear Mr. Stonehound. And you be still too, Felicia. It's not polite to argue with a guest, especially one who's travelled halfway around the world, to give us the benefit of his experience. Do tell us more, Mr. Stone. Thank you, dear lady. What I mean to say is that if there are spirits, and you call them up, you can't tell what you'll get. If there are spirits, there must be wicked ones, don't you think? In India, they tell tales of an evil spirit. It's called a baitar or a vatala or some such thing. It gets into corpses somehow and makes them move about, and it draws the life out of every living thing it touches. Would you like to call one of those? Could you put it down again? It sounds like a vampire, Felicia suggested. Vampire? Oh, you mean that old book by Lord Byron? Byron! Read it when I was a lad. Quite made my hair stand on end. I suppose it's the same sort of thing. Please forgive me for contradicting you, said Felicia with excessive sweetness, but The Vampire was written by Lord Byron's physician, Dr. Polidori. When it's necessary to write horror, to avoid talking to Lord Byron. I know a gentleman who met them both. Really? No doubt you're right. Not much of a literary man myself. She reads too much, mumbled Calendar, but he was ignored. And take the ghouls, continued Stone. What? Demanded Calendar. Ghouls, and not the kind we have here. Not grave robbers exactly. The Indian ghouls are creatures who tear open graves and, well, they feast on what they find there. How horrible! Aunt Penelope shuddered cheerfully. Isn't it? Of course we eat dead things ourselves, don't we? I hope the sheep who provided this excellent mutton has gone to its reward, eh? Oh, Mr. Stone, laughed Mr. Penelope, you're a wicked, wicked man. What's all this talk of robbing graves? Reginald Calendar was on his feet, a brimming glass of brandy in his hand. You see what she does, he shouted. She turns us all into ghouls. He whirled to face Felicia, and the brandy splashed over the front of her gown. Damn! Shouted Calendar. He snatched up a napkin and applied it vigorously to her bodice. Your hands, sir, cried Felicia. Mr. Calendar, gasped Aunt Penelope. My word, said Nigel Stone. Felicia Lamb jumped up and gathered her skirts around her. I believe it's time we were all in bed, she announced. Her ordinarily pale face was flushed a hot pink.
Fine, roared Calendar. Let's all go together.
Felicia, her head held high, swept from the room. Calendar laughed harshly and sat back into his chair, barely conscious of his surroundings.
"Oh dear," said Aunt Penelope.
"Time to go home, old fellow," said Stone, pulling the comatose Calendar to his feet. "My apologies, Miss Penelope. You took our uncle's death very hard."
"Good night, Mr. Stone. I hope you will call on us again."
"Nothing would please me more," said Stone, grunting over the weight of his burden as he backed towards the door. "Good night."
Almost before he knew it, Nigel Stone was in the street. He might as well have been at sea. The thick yellow fog made London look like a spirit world, one in which the misty glow of the street lamps revealed nothing but their own iridescence. His cousin was on his feet, but not much more. They had walked to dinner from Uncle William's house, and Stone knew that it would not be far that way, but he was a bit worse for the wine himself, and not really sure of his bearings. He longed for a cab, and he wondered how lost he was. Calendar said, "Sally," several times, but this only confused his cousin more. Helping Calendar across an intersection, Nigel Stone heard a horse snorting and dragged his burden back to a flat spot only a few feet from Felicia Lamb's house. Later, he convinced himself that he hadn't spoken to the driver, because he realised they hadn't the money to hire a ride. What really decided him, though, before he even thought of his purse, was the sinister look of the driver. He was gaunt and pale, with dark hollows for eyes, and down the left side of his face ran a horrible scar. Jesus, Sebastian, mate, can you not, stop lurking all the time, everywhere? It's just creepy. 7. The Bride of Death. Felicia Lamb heard the old clock downstairs strike midnight before she thought it safe to rise from her curtained bed and begin to dress. It took her some time to prepare herself, but she was determined to do everything with exquisite care, for this was to be her ultimate rendezvous with the unknown. She held neither lamp nor candle when she slowly pulled open the door of her bedchamber and slept out into the dark hall, but she had lived in this house all her life and had no need of light to show her the way. Her only fear was that she might be detected, and that her aunt or even the servants might try to protect her from what could be considered danger, which she knew she had desired since the day of her birth. So that she could be sure of silence, her feet were bare. She tiptoed quickly down the carpeted staircase, her hand resting heavily on the banister so that her tread would be light, then walked confidently through the hallway towards the door that led to the world, beyond the home of her mother and father. She felt for the bolt, moved it with a practised hand, and opened the door. Yellow fog drifted in to meet her, and she stepped out into its embrace. She pulled the iron key from her bosom and locked the house behind her so that all within it might be safe. Then she stepped out into the shrouded street, wrapping her hooded cloak around her. The coach was where she was told it would be waiting. Neither she nor the driver spoke a word, and the hooves of the horses had been muffled. There was hardly a sound to disturb the sleep of London as the coach rolled unerringly through the impenetrable mist. Felicia still held the key clutched tightly in her fingers, but when her conveyance had rounded several corners, she threw her key into the gutter. It would never be recognised, and she did not intend to use it again. A nice Chianti. She sat back quietly and waited to reach her destination, not even bothering to glance out of the windows until the horses came to a smooth stop. She alighted without a moment's hesitation and stood almost blinded in thick clouds that might have been born in heaven or hell. A figure materialised beside her, almost as if it had drawn its substance from the fog. It guided her through a doorway and into darkness. Something shut behind her. The two moved forward together through a passageway which held at its end a globe of luminescence. Felicia felt that she was in a dream. The light resolved itself into a glowing ball of crystal, resting on an ebony table with chairs at either end, and casting its pale yellow light on an all-encompassing shroud of black velvet curtains. She was in the consulting room of Sebastian Newcastle, and he stood at her side. He moved away from her and seated himself at the far end of the table, his face aglow in a sickly light. "Will you not remove your cloak and sit with me, Miss Lamb?" Felicia did neither. She was suddenly hesitant, suspicious. "Is this what you have promised me?" she said. "Only another séance?" "Might it not be better so? There is much you could learn as you are, and there is much more that you may not wish to know." "Then you have lied to me, sir." The light before Sebastian Newcastle's face flickered and dimmed. "Will you not wait, Felicia? What you seek comes soon enough and lasts forever." "Another séance, then? Will you call upon the dead for me? Will you call the shade of anyone I name?" "I shall do what I can." "Then call for me the spirit of a wizard, a master of the darkness, one who mastered death and reckoned not the price. Call for me the spirit of your double, Don Sebastian de Villanueva. Can you do it, Mr. Sebastian Newcastle? Do you dare? I can, but do you dare to let me? Have I not asked it of you? You have, he said. You have asked too often to be denied, and yet the blame will be all mine. I absolve you, said Felicia Lang. Spoken like the angel you so fervently desire to be, Sebastian said. His voice was almost brutal. Will you do me the courtesy to sit down? You can hardly hope to frighten me with gruff tones when we have come so far, Felicia said. No, nothing will frighten you, but what you cannot change. And when that terror comes, will you be brave enough to bear it, or brave enough to put an end to it? Surely I shall be one or the other, she replied as she seated herself at the table. Shall we begin? I warned you because I care for you, Sebastian said. I believe it, she said. Now show me who it is that cares for me so much. She reached out for his cold hand, but he drew back. He did not speak. He crossed his arms before his face, and the light in the crystal was snuffed out for an instant. The black room was entombed in ebony. Felicia stared ahead, her hand at her heart, more frightened than she would have admitted under torture. Something was about to happen, and she had longed for it, but she was half afraid that she would be ravished and murdered in the dark. Was that what she had demanded? She hoped for a vision, but instead she heard a voice. It might have been human, indeed it might have been human, but in the low, echoing, senseless syllables it sounded more like an animal in agony. It ended in a note that was a hollow song of pain. Sebastian's face appeared abruptly in the gloom. The flesh glowed in the pale blue light of putrescence, pale blue light of putrescence, and the flame of decay grew brighter, until the features burned away and left only a gleaming silver skull beneath. It spoke to her. What is worse than death, my love? Flee from it. The mouth that moved was full of unnaturally sharp teeth that gleamed like swords. The skull screamed and then burst into flame. A dull and rusted blade dropped from the ceiling and sundered the skull from whatever held it erect. The flashes of fire turned coal blue as it rolled across the table towards Felicia. The hollow sockets where its eyes had been bubbled up with globes of glistening jelly, while locks of black and silky hair sprouted from the burnished surface of the silver skull. Show off. The head fell upon her breast, and almost at once Sebastian was in her arms. The black room was alive with silver. I am the one you seek, he said. Turn away. Felicia pulled away from him and stood, leaving him on his knees. His head bent over the arms of the ebony chair. He turned toward her, relieved to think that she would run from all that he could offer her. She took a deep breath and pulled the dark hood from her face and the dark cloak from her body. I am the one you seek, she said. Would you deny my desire, and your own? She wore a white wedding gown, its silk scarcely paler than her own ivory flesh. The gown had been her mother's 40 years ago, when fashion was more graceful and less refined. Her arms were bare, her shoulders were bare, and her breasts were almost bare as well, the silk gathered beneath them and flowing down in delicate folds that brushed against the ebony floor. Welcome to the male gaze. Felicia would never have dared to dress in such a manner if it had not been her wedding night, but now she exulted in her shamelessness. The glow around her turned to silk, her skin, her pale eyes, and her ashen hair to silver. The black figure of Sebastian glided towards her. Destiny, he murmured. He grasped her almost cruelly. She felt his cold breath upon her throat, his cold fingers in her flowing hair. She arched her back and exposed her white neck, but Sebastian pulled her forward and turned away from her. He would not look at her as he spoke. I have become what I am, a creature of the night, who feeds on blood, because I would not die. Why should you, a young woman with years of life before her, spurn the most precious gift in all creation? Because I would know more of its creator. She reached out to touch his shoulder. If you care nothing for yourself, think of your friends. Think of your family. I have no friends, Alicia said, and as for my family, those I love most have gone before me. As for Aunt Penelope, I think she will be content with my fortune. And the young man? You have seen what he is. I wish to God that I had seen it sooner. Then there is nothing for you in the world. Nothing but to be rid of it. Then at least die a true death, Sebastian said, and I will guide your spirit as I do those others you have seen, those who are lost. Take poison, cut your throat, jump from a tower. Do anything but take this curse upon yourself. For many centuries I have carried it alone, and it is better so. You have not renounced your fate. In truth, I think you relish it. You'd have to be the Lord of life and death to stand between them and cast a cold eye on both. Is it because I am a woman that you think I do not know my own desires? Do you think that I am not as brave as you? Could it not be that I have been sent to end your loneliness forever? Sebastian wheeled to confront her, his face a mask of fury. Loneliness? Why need I be lonely when I have companions such as this to comfort me? The glowing curtains rippled in the black and silver room behind Sebastian. A shape appeared behind them, aimless, clumsy, menacing, and utterly sad. A faltering white hand emerged through the drapes, and despite herself, Felicia gasped. What shuffled into the room had been a boy. His shaggy hair was red, but his slack-jawed face was almost grey, and his eyes were those of an idiot. His lips were drooling and his teeth were sharp. He limped towards Sebastian, one leg twisted and broken.
Please, sir,
he muttered. My God, Sebastian, Felicia said. What is this? A grave robber. He said his name was Henry Donahue. I found him and another at the work, and killed the first one outright, but by the time I caught young Donahue again, my fury and my bloodlust were so great that I slaked my thirst on him. And here he is, one of the living dead, and quite mad. I should have destroyed him, and surely I must, but now I am happy to have been delayed. Gaze on him. Is this what you wish to become? At the sound of her voice, the long dead boy had turned towards Felicia. He dragged his shattered leg across the black carpet, his eyes fastened on her throat. Felicia felt suddenly naked and defenceless.
Please, miss,
said the boy. He touched her. Suddenly his hands were reaching for her throat, his dirty little teeth gnashing at the air as she tried to push him away. There was a strange strength in his small fingers. Felicia screamed. The boy had her half sprawled on the enemy table, when Sebastian yanked him back by his red hair and threw him across the room. Half of his scalp stayed in Sebastian's hand, and his head was a raw but bloodless wound as he implacably scuttled over the floor to reach the woman he wanted. Sebastian pounced on him again, caught his twisted leg, and dragged the snarling creature through the velvet curtains and out of the room. Felicia was alone, heart pounding, her breath coming in frantic gasps. She was terrified and yet exhilarated too. She struggled down from the tabletop and collapsed into an ebony chair. From somewhere in the recesses of the house came a high-pitched wail of agony that rose to a crescendo and then stopped abruptly. Felicia knew she would never see the boy again. She waited. When Sebastian returned to her, his hair hung over his face, and his clothes were torn. His hands were spotted with blood. He looked at them, and then at Felicia. There was little enough in him, Sebastian said. He had been starved. But now you see what I would save you from? Felicia trembled, but she remained where she was. Between you and this boy is as much difference as there must have been in life, she said. I will not be like him. Go! Shouted Sebastian. But even as he did, he advanced upon her, his mouth twisting uncontrollably. Felicia gritted her teeth and clutched the arms of the ebony chair with all her might. She held her head high and felt the pulses throbbing in her long, white neck as Sebastian overwhelmed her. Then they were on the carpet, her carefully coiffed pale hair spilled upon its darkness, her gown in disarray, her body throbbing with delight and dread. Hot. She felt an ecstasy of fear, stunned more by the desires of her flesh than by the small, sweet sting she felt as he sank into her, and life flowed between them. She rocked and moaned beneath the body of the man she loved. She took life and love and death and made them one. And when it was over, Sebastian arose alone. She lay at ease, her limbs sprawled in graceful carelessness, her face marked by abandon, hardly tinged by shock. She was pale as a marble statue, coloured with a few drops of Virgin's blood. She was at peace, but Sebastian knew that she would rise full of dark desire when the next sun set. Even his tears, when they came, were tinged with her bright blood. Wow. Well. 8. The final note. Stone paced through the empty rooms of the echoing house he shared with his cousin. He had been in the place for less than a day, but already its atmosphere oppressed him. He knew that Calendar was upstairs somewhere, sleeping off what must have been an appalling headache, yet somehow the mansion seemed utterly deserted, a fit abode for ghosts rather than men. Excuse me. Out of sheer desperation, Stone was tempted to drop off himself on the settee in the study that had served him as a bed, but he fought the temptation, though there was little enough for a man to do in London when he had no money and no friends. It wasn't even a fit day for a stroll around the town, unfortunately. A heavy rain had been falling for most of the afternoon, interrupted from time to time by distant growls of thunder and dim glimmerings of lightning. Still, Stone decided that a storm would be more stimulating than wandering through a house that seemed half-haunted. He headed for the door, threw it open, and stared out into the street. The rain rattled down and splashed in the gutters. The wind blew some of it into Stone's face. Across the way, a man scrambled for shelter, and his antics made Stone feel very satisfied to be indoors at all. And yet something in the power of the elements made him feel strong and alive. He remembered how he'd run shouting through storms when he'd been a boy. As he looked out on nature's fury, Stone saw a coach round a corner and pull up in front of the doorway that sheltered him. The horses steamed and shivered in the downpour. Stone felt a trifle foolish to be standing there, but would have been even more ashamed to duck back inside like a frightened child, especially when the coachman ducked down from his perch, his high hat dripping, and scrambled up the steps to meet him. Stone did his best to act like a prosperous householder. "Mr. Nigel Stone?" asked the coachman. "What? Me?" stammered Stone. Yes, of course it's me. What can I do for you, my good man?" "Message for you from a lady, sir. She said to wait for an answer." He pulled a piece of paper from somewhere inside his soaking coat and handed it to Stone. The wet ink was already beginning to blur.
"My dear Mr. Stone, please come at once if you can. Come without Mr. Calendar. My niece Felicia vanished last night, and I fear for her safety. I believe I can rely on you, and no one else."
A drop of rain turned the signature to a grey smudge, but there could be no doubt about the name. Stone felt pleasure at the summons, and then a twinge of shame that he should take delight in the misfortune of a young woman. "I'll come at once," he said. "Then come with me, sir. I'll wait here while you get your greatcoat." "No need for that," mumbled Stone. He was embarrassed to confess that he owned no such garment, but not quite desperate enough to pilfer his cousin's. He hoped the countryman would take his scanty costume as a sign of dedication rather than desperation. A blast of thunder ripped the sky apart as he hurried down the steps. The same thunder woke Reginald Calendar at last. He cursed and sat so quickly that he wrenched his back. His sheets were soaked with his own sweat, and they had begun to stink. He itched all over, and he started to tremble as soon as he awoke. That man has very serious alcoholism. and when he heard the rain, he was seized with a wild desire to run naked into London and wash himself clean. But he had just enough judgment left to realise this might not be wise. Calendar huddled under his quilts and pulled damp pillows off his head, trying without much success to shut out the world. Now that he was conscious again, he could not bear to lie awake alone with his own thoughts. Visions of doom handed him in his own bed. He could not stay there. He crawled out into the clammy air and began to shiver. He called for the servants, even though he knew that they were gone. Then he called for his cousin Nigel, but there was no reply. He felt utterly abandoned. The house was too big for him. He had a sudden, unreasoning fear of being a small speck in a vast space. It was unbearable. He pulled on such clothes as he could find and took a pull from the bottle beside the bed. He thanked heaven for his uncle's cellar, which was still his, even if the house would soon be sold for debts, and he dreaded the day when the wine would run out. I think Reginald has brought all this shit entirely upon himself, and he probably deserves it. It's not his house, though. It's mortgaged to the hilt, as we were informed by the lawyer earlier on. He drank again, and he heard the rain battering against his window. He hardly cared for the weather, though, when his mind was in such an uproar. There was a need in him to escape from these walls and from his memories. Compared to them, a thunderstorm was a small thing. A song rang through his head, a tantalising tune that meant nothing yet said much. Against it as a counterpoint rang heavy sounds of resentment and recrimination, memories of an evening when he had said and done much that might not be forgiven. Much wiser, he thought, to follow the notes of the sweeter, shallower song, and to forget the rest. He felt in his pockets, found a few shillings, and then staggered down the staircase and out the door to stand under the streaming skies. He had no cash for a cab, but he knew the way to the glass slipper. Excuse me. His journey was a vision. Water fell in curtains before him, and it rose in glistening fountains at every curve. Rainbows formed in every gaslight, and phantoms in the fog. His way was weary, but he was too tired to rest. From time to time, the whirling wheels that passed him covered him in water, but it was no more to him than paint on lips that were already scarlet. Drenched and deranged, Reginald Calendar made his way through the forgotten street until he reached his remembered goal. The glass globes figure over the flickering flames at the entrance of the glass slipper seemed to Calendar like stars in the heavens. He slept over cigars, mud and orange peels to reach the arch where a shilling brought his way into the saloon bar. "Boys, a bottle of fizz?" Calendar pushed the drab out of his way and proceeded up to the balcony. This had always been a disorderly house, but now it struck him as the true home of chaos. Each face he saw was a twisted demon shape, and each voice a mockery. He was vaguely aware that some spurned him for the unshaven, sodden wretch he had become, but it mattered little when he knew he was so close to Sally Wood. "Give your orders, gentlemen, please!" The harsh voice cut through the tobacco fumes and the smell of stale beer and cheap perfume. In another life, Calendar would have ignored the summons, but now that he was destitute, he felt compelled to buy a glass of beer. A girl with plump arms and a vacant face offered to sell him sweets from a glass jar, but she backed away when she saw his expression. The orchestra stuck up a tinny tune, and it was one Calendar recognised. The gods were with him after all. It was Sally's song. Some girl plays a price on their maidenhood, and defend it, never spend it till the price is good. They wouldn't give a gent a tumble if they could. They couldn't if they would. They wouldn't if they could. But everybody knows Sally would. And there she was, in a gaudy red dress, strutting saucily across the stage. She bawled out her litany, her skirts hiked up to her garters, and Calendar dreamed of what lay beyond them. He wondered how many men shared the same dreams, perhaps even the same memories, and he hated them all. Someone clapped him on the back and handed him a glass of brandy. He didn't even notice who it was. When Sally hit her final note and made a low curtsy in her low-cut dress, he stood stock still and stared while every other man in the glass slipper gave vent to boisterous shouts and applause. He did not move as Sally leapt from the stage, wove her way expertly through the orchestra, pushed through the crowd with a few playful slaps, and hurried up to the balcony bar. She passed within a few feet of Calendar on her way to the spot where a man with a leathery face and grey side whiskers was standing. There was a bottle of champagne beside him on the bar, and he poured Sally a glass as she approached, her face flushed and her chestnut hair flowing. Calendar awoke from his paralysis and stumbled towards Sally. She turned, and when he grasped her arm, "Reggie," she said, then she laughed. "You do look a sight."
"It's the rain."
"You better go home, dear, or you'll catch your death. I'll talk to you another night." She turned her back on him.
"Sally, you'll talk to me now."
He reached out for her again, but the stranger put himself between them.
"You can see the lady is occupied," he said.
His tone was the one that Calendar had been accustomed to use when talking to servants. Calendar tried to push him away, but the man was like an oak. Calendar took a swing at the man, who ducked back without hesitation, then put a bony fist in his opponent's face. Calendar was surprised to find himself sitting on the floor. His nose and mouth felt hot and wet. There was laughter all around him. He was trying to decide what to do when he had another shock. He saw Sally slap her escort's face. This brought another roar from the crowd, which burst into wilder applause than it had ever granted one of her songs, when Sally knelt down beside the stricken Calendar and took him in her arms. "Come on, Reggie," she said. "You're all right."
"Sally?"
He didn't know what else to say.
"That's all right, dear. You come along with me. Can't have my husband murdered, can I?"
Her words hardly registered as she helped him to his feet and out of the glass slipper. The rain was still falling, and Calendar lifted his face towards it to wash away the blood. He hardly looked where he was walking, but he was conscious enough to remember that her lodgings were just around the corner from the music hall. He dragged his boots through a puddle like a child, and he found a kind of pleasure in it. He'd begun to love the storm. When the thunder rumbled, he made the same sort of noise himself. Sally just looked at him and smiled. She led him up 2 flights of stairs and into a disordered room, as full of jumble as his own dwelling was barren, then sat him down on an unmade bed covered with clothes. He saw a pamphlet half hidden by a dress and picked it up.
"So reading Penny Dreadful, Sal?"
"Ah, you mean the vampire? You should take that along, Reggie. I'm finished with that bit and it's awfully good."
Calendar shrugged and stuffed the thing into his pocket. His mind was fuddled, but somewhere in it was the glimmer of an idea. There was something else too, something else he wanted to remember.
Look here. What was that you said to me back at the slipper? Hey?
"What do you mean, dear? Take off your coat, it's wet."
"Leave me alone, I want to be wet."
"Have it your own way then," said Sally, peeling off her gown and posing before him in a corset. "I just wanted to get you warm."
"Warm, is it? And what did you say to me back there about a husband?"
She sat beside him and ran her tongue across his lips.
"Any little girl has to take care of her intended, Reggie."
He looked at her blearily.
"You must be mad," he said.
"No, if I'm not, you promised to marry me. Right here in this very bed, and I mean to hold you to it, Mr. Reginald Calendar."
"Dreaming," she said. "What? One of us is dreaming. Whatever made you think that I would marry you?"
"You did, dear. When your uncle died, you said you were wealthy and you were right. You said he'd make an honest woman of me. And now he's dead, ain't he? I can see you took it hard with your kind heart, but that will pass, and then we'll be wed. You do love me, don't you, dear? There's nobody else."
He fumbled at her, more out of habit than passion.
"Of course there's nobody else," he said.
"No?"
Sally pushed him down on the bed and slapped him harder when she had the man in the glass slipper.
"And what about Miss Felicia Lamb?"
Calendar was too stunned to reply.
"You think I'm stupid, don't you? You thought I didn't know about her. What do you take me for?"
Calendar just sat on the bed and looked across the room.
"Here," said Sally, "have some gin."
She poured a bottle from a pile of dresses in the corner and gave it to Calendar. He uncorked it and poured half of it down his throat.
"That's right," said Sally. "Get yourself used to the idea. You thought I was just a silly girl. That's what you think of all of us, ain't it? And that's why we do what we can to protect ourselves. You recollect a girl named Alice, your uncle's maid? We were good friends, Alice and me. She told me all about you. Now, I don't begrudge you a bit of fun, Reggie. I've had mine. We'll forget Alice, even if she has seen more of your uncle's money than I ever did. But I won't let you marry this Felicia Lamb."
Calendar took another pull on the bottle and put his head in his hands. The liquor burned against his bleeding gums. This was hardly the evening he had planned.
I saw her once, you know, Sally said. A blue-blood virgin with big eyes and a tiny mouth. She's no woman for a man like you. I'll bet she wouldn't even raise her skirt to piss.
It was Calendar's turn to slap Sally. Then he picked up his hat and his stick and shuffled towards the door. "She is the woman I love," he said.
"Love, is it?"
shouted Sally.
"See how much you love you find there after today, Mr. Calendar. She'll have nothing to do with you now. You're mine. Do you think I spent 2 years on my back for the peer pressure of it?"
She rushed to follow him, shouting in his ear. Calendar summoned up a drunken dignity. "There is nothing you can do to prevent this marriage," she said, "and you and I shall not meet again."
"I've stopped you already,"
Sally screamed.
"I sent her a note. That's what I did. A letter telling her what you had been to me. She'll have read it by now, and that'll be end to any love between you."
Calendar staggered back towards against the door. To have lost 2 fortunes in so short a time was more than he could bear. Without thinking, without even wishing to, he slammed his iron-beating walking stick into Sally's face. She seemed bewildered, and she made a whimpering sound. He saw by the candlelight that he turned her right eye into red pulp. She put her hand to her face and something came away in it. She dropped to her knees and began to wail. Calendar was horrified. He stooped to help her, but she pushed him away and crawled across the floor. She began to scream. It was intolerable. He hit her again, this time on top of her head, but it only made her screams louder. He struck her twice more. The stick broke and Sally slumped to the floor. The screaming stopped. Calendar ran down the stairs and onto the street. In an alley in the rain, he vomited again and again. Oh, I forgot that content warning. At first he thought it would kill him, but when he was done, his head began to clear. The storm was lifting and the gleams of lightning seemed to come from miles away. He was almost home when he realised that he was holding only half a stick. He gazed at the jagged stump in disbelief. He tried to convince himself that he dropped the other half somewhere in the street, but he felt a sick certainty that it was lying beside Sally Wood. Could it be used to identify him? Calendar had heard of the detective inspectors newly appointed at Scotland Yard, and the tricks they could play in catching criminals of every kind. He could not take the chance of leaving anything behind. The journey back was agonising. He wanted nothing less than to visit Sally Wood again, yet speed seemed imperative since he knew her corpse would be discovered eventually. He had to be there and gone before it was. He could not bear to think of what would happen if he were caught with her corpse, yet he could not think of anything else. He wanted a drink. He was half tempted to hurry home for one, yet all the while his feet were carrying him back to the glass slipper. His thoughts were so agitated that he found himself there before he was quite prepared. Several loungers stood outside, and the faint sound of music came from within. It was as if nothing had happened. Could it be that they didn't know? The thought froze Calendar for an instant, then he backed into the shadows of the alley. For the first time in his life he was afraid to be seen. Yet it was madness to remain here, a few feet from his crime, but doing nothing to conceal it. He pulled down his hat and turned up his collar, as if seeking protection from the rain, then stepped casually out into the street and walked briskly round the corner. He looked up at Sally's solitary window, where a light still burned. There was no hue and cry, no sign of anything but sleep. He pushed the street door open cautiously, thinking whatever power might protect him that he had neglected to close anything behind him in his hurry to be gone. He crept up the stairs, his ear cocked for the slightest sound. The house was still, he thought wryly, as a tomb. And so it remained until he reached Sally's door. The sound he heard behind it gave him a chill as the rain could not. He knew it must be his imagination, some symptom of a guilty conscience, but he could have sworn he recognised the melody of the song Sally had performed at the glass slipper not more than an hour ago. Someone seemed to be humming it. Could this be a ghost? Another trick of that damned spiritualist? He didn't believe it. He couldn't. It had to be a trick of his own mind, a small thing really, and he needed the rest of that stick. He opened the door. What he saw was worse than he feared. It was Sally, her face awash with blood, her pretty hair matted down with it. She was crawling on her hands and knees around the room, singing her song as best she could through lips that dribbled blood. She had not died at all, but clearly she should have. Sally knocked over a table, but she still sang her song. Calendar realised that he had damaged her beyond repair. She had no idea that he was in the room. Her mouth twitched uncontrollably as he raised his boot and brought it down with all his weight on the back of Sally's neck. He heard the spine snap. He needed the last of the gin he took from her. He picked up the second half of his walking stick and hurried home to his bed, where he spent the next 3 days attempting to convince himself that he had never left it.
Oh, that's brutal.
Visceral. Also, apparently I've missed a vomit content warning. Content warning! There's a lot of content warnings. Let's copy and paste them again, just in case. Plus, vomiting. 9. The heiress. 3 men dressed in blue gathered in front of a tall brick house near the gates of All Souls Cemetery. Their high hats held sturdy metal frames, and their knee-length coats had buttons made of brass. In each man's belt was a wooden staff. One of them used his to knock on the door. They waited in the darkness and the damp. One of them shivered in the cold. "There's no one here," he said. "We should have come by day." "And so we have, some of us, but they had no answer then, any more than we have now." "We could break down the door." "We're only seeking information from a gentleman. The people have little enough use for Scotland Yard without us making a name for ourselves as housebreakers." "Then I'll knock again." "I'll give the orders here," said the man with the staff, but he used it again anyway. A light appeared in one of the windows. "Oh, we've roused someone. Be still, will you?" The door opened slowly and silently. A tall man with a black moustache appeared on the threshold, a black candle in his hand. Its flickering light... Jesus, black candles as well, for fuck's sake, Don Sebastian. Its flickering light gleamed unpleasantly on a long scar that ran down the left side of his face. "Good evening, sir. I hope we have not disturbed you." "I have been sleeping, Constable. What brings you here?" "A woman, sir. Miss Felicia Lamb." I do not see her here with you." "No, sir. She's not to be seen anywhere, and that's what concerns us. Are you Mr. Newcastle, sir?" "I am." "Well, sir, we've been informed that Miss Lamb was a frequent visitor here, and she's vanished. We take it upon ourselves to make inquiries. We'd be most appreciative of any help." "I see. Tell me, Constable, how long has she been missing?" "Just 3 days. It's Sunday, and she was last seen on Thursday night, at a dinner party." "It has been longer than that since I have seen Miss Lamb, Constable. Have you spoken with the people who dined with her?" "2 of them, sir. Her aunt, who mentioned us to you, and a friend of the family, Mr. Nigel Stone. The third would be your betrothed, Mr. Calendar. We have visited him several times, but nobody home." "Perhaps they have run away together." "Yes, we thought of that, but why should they elope when they was already pledged? Cockney's hard. From what I have seen of Mr. Calendar, he is a most headstrong young man." "So we have been told. You know him, sir?" "We have met twice, and even on such short acquaintance, I could not form a high opinion of his character." That's very polite. That's a very polite way to say he is a complete ass. "As you say, sir, we've had reports that he'd been drinking heavily." "Just so. Is there more that I can do for you, Constable? Would you care to search for Miss Lamb within?" Sebastian Newcastle stepped inside and gestured into the black recesses of his home. The 3 men from Scotland Yard looked into the darkness and then at each other. "Well, sir," said the leader, "since you've been good enough to offer, it follows that we needn't bother you tonight. Clearly you have nothing to hide." "Then may I bid you good night, gentlemen? The hour is late." "Just so, sir. Thanks for your trouble, and good night to you." Drunken, yes, typical of men of his status, yes. Sebastian shut the door and stood for a few moments with nothing to keep him company but the small flame of his candle. When he knew that the men had gone, he turned into the deep depths of the house and called for Alicia, but he knew before he spoke that there would be no answer. She could not be constrained at night. She wandered ever weaker through the valley of stones where the dead slept. Sebastian went out into the night. He dissolved into an iridescent fog, cool trick, before the gates, and drifted into All Souls, part of the thick mist that made the land look like a forgotten sea, whose turbulence hid all the wreckage of tortured trees and abandoned monuments. The landscape was more like a limbo for unhappy spirits than a part of the green earth. He found Felicia sitting on a monument, her pale arms wrapped around the marble figure of an angel, her pale eyes staring off into the fog. "3 men came to look for you," he said.
"And did 3 men leave?"
"Since they came from Scotland Yard, it seemed unwise to detain any of them."
"Police," Felicia said. "Have I destroyed your sanctuary here, Sebastian?"
"Perhaps, but that matters little when I see you as you are."
"I am as I wish to be."
"And was it worth it then to see life and death as 2 sides of the same coin, and to hold that coin in your own hand?"
"I have learned much," Felicia said.
"You have learned more than you bargained for. The price of that coin is blood." Felicia hugged herself and looked down at the ground.
"I cannot, Sebastian," she said.
"And yet you must," he said, "and most assuredly you will. The lives of others must become your life, and their blood your own. It is your fate, and none may resist it."
"I shall, I swear it. You know what I am now better than any other could, but whatever I have become, I am still innocent of blood. I shall not stain my soul with it."
Sebastian turned away from her. She rose and took his arm. "I meant no reproach to you," he said.
"Then I must reproach myself. As you have said, I know what will become of you."
"Oh, sorry, no, wrong people.
I meant a reproach to you," she said.
"Then I must reproach myself. As you have said, I know what will become of you. You will grow weaker, and the thirst will grow stronger. Until at length you will be transformed into the thirst. You saw how long I could resist you, for all my wish to do so. You did what you desired to do, what I desired you to do, Felicia said. I would have done it anyway. Sebastian took her beautiful pale face in his cold hands. You came to me as my bride, he said, and I have been alone too long. Now I must see that you survive. Is there no other way? If you can resist the thirst, then it will doom you. Your body will become too frail to move, and still it will contain your soul. Your spirit will never be free to seek the worlds beyond our own. You will be trapped in a lifeless husk, and you will be truly damned. She gazed deeply into his dark eyes, then stiffened in his arms at the sound of a human voice nearby. A lantern gleamed dully through the yellow fog. 3 men, she said, long before she could see them. The constables, Sebastian said. Then let us greet them, and be done with this. She laughed loudly and bitterly. 3 dark figures emerged from the mist, clustering around their light as if they feared to lose it. Mr. Newcastle, one of them said. Sebastian bowed slightly, but made no reply. And Miss Felicia Lamb. And what is that to you? Felicia snapped. Your aunt said you were lost, my miss, and now I am found. Just so, miss, but look where we found you. In a graveyard at night with nothing to cover you but a nightgown. This is my mother's wedding dress. Oh, I see. A wedding dress, is it? A runaway heiress and a foreign gentleman. You weren't quite honest with us, were you, Mr. Newcastle? Sometimes a gentleman must keep his tongue, Constable. Oh, no. Sorry, that's Felicia. Sometimes a gentleman must keep his tongue, Constable, Felicia said. Though you seem to know nothing of that. No, miss, I'm no gentleman, right enough. Just a rough fellow trying to do his job. Still, I offer protection, if you ask for it. This is no fit place for a young lady, and no fit company, if I'm any judge. You may never live to be a judge, Sebastian said. He cast his eye on the lantern in the constable's hand. At once its faint flame turned to blazing red. The metal was too hot to hold. The man screamed in anguish as he dropped the light. Suddenly there was only blackness and the smell of burning flesh. There is danger in the dark, Sebastian said as he moved forward. He felt Felicia's grip on his shoulder and saw her pale eyes imploring him to stop. Together they watched the 3 men scramble away through the tombstones and the trees. At last there was silence. There will be danger from them, Sebastian finally said. We might have feasted, and now we must flee. Was it wise for you to stop me? I stopped you because I wanted nothing more than to let you go. To join you, in fact. The one on the right, the young one. I wanted him. He was yours, Felicia. He can be yours in a moment. No, Sebastian, it must not be. I cannot do what you have done. I never thought of it. I only dreamed of death and peace and freedom. I wanted knowledge, not the power to destroy. There is more to know, Sebastian said, and time enough to know it. But only if you will take life. She pulled back from him and leaned against a marble slab, engraved in the name of one long dead. She had never seemed more beautiful to him, and never more beloved than when she renounced all that he could offer her. You have thrown away the mortal life that you were born to live, he said, and if you throw away this second chance, there will be nothing left for you but an eternity of emptiness. Would that be so different from what you endure? At least I still exist. I walk the earth. What could be more precious? Then this is all your magic offers you, a chance to walk the earth like other men. Other men die, Sebastian said. Felicia reached out to him, took 1 step forward, and then sank to her knees. Help me, she murmured. He looked down at her compassionately. You must not kneel to me, or any man. I did not do it willingly, she said. I cannot stand. You must have blood, and you must have it now. No, she said. Too late. No blood, no life. She sank into the damp grass. Sebastian hovered over her. He tried to raise her to her feet. He kissed her. He shouted at her. Nothing mattered. She could not be awakened. Sebastian swept her up in his arms and moved towards his house, but he realized that once men would be waiting for him there. He turned back towards the stones, towards the tombs he'd guarded for half a century, but there was no consolation in them. He searched her face for some faint flicker of life and saw nothing but cold perfection. Yet he knew that her soul was trapped within her corpse and would remain there until time stopped. He put her to rest in the tomb and raged through the night. Dogs howled, marble shattered like glass, and 3 men who trembled in night fog came to the decision that their investigations might be best conducted in the light of day. Ten. The Wine Cellar. Reginald Calendar awoke to the sound of distant and insistent banging. It came from far enough away so that it drifted slowly into his consciousness, becoming part of his dreams before it ended them. He was striking something again and again with his cane. Then he was staring at the ceiling. His head throbbed with each repeated blow on the door downstairs, but Calendar only cursed quietly and waited for the noise to stop. He wondered what day it was, and even if it were day at all. He raised one crusted eyelid and saw a stray shaft of sunlight break through the drawn curtains. Then he went back to sleep. The next time he was disturbed, there was no putting it off. Someone had him by the shoulders and was shaking him more savagely than the aftermath of drink could ever do. A splash of cold water hit him in the face. Calendar shouted, sputtered, and looked up into the ruddy face of his cousin. "God damn you, sir!" Calendar roared. "Have you gone completely mad?" "You call me mad, do you? It's Monday morning. Where have you been for 4 days, eh? Do you know what's happened to the girl you're going to marry?" "What? Sally?"
"Who's Sally? What are you talking about? I mean Miss Lamb."
"Felicia, of course. I went to see her. When was it? But the servant said she wasn't at home to me."
"She wasn't at home to anyone, my dear fellow. She's been missing for the best part of a week."
Calendar pulled himself into a sitting position.
"How long has she been gone?"
"Since last Thursday, the night we had dinner at her house. The night I came to visit you."
"It's been a short enough visit then, hasn't it? Where have you been ever since? And where's that bottle?
My head." Calendar felt under his bed and came up with what he sought.
"I thought you'd finished all the brandy," Stone said.
"Oh, I did, but there's plenty of port. And now there's cause to celebrate as well. Felicia could never have read that letter, could she?"
"Letter? What letter?"
"A note from someone who wanted to drive us apart. Hasn't anyone seen it?"
"Who cares for letters at a time like this?" demanded Stone.
No, of course not." Calendar took a drink of wine. "And you say Felicia's gone?"
"Well, we did have some word of her."
"We?" Stone's face turned a bit redder.
"I've been with her aunt, Miss Penelope. She's terribly concerned, of course."
"Oh, you've been busy. The Belchinese is missing, and what was your lodging in an elegant house with this Spinster aunt?"
"I'm doing what should have been done by you," Stone replied defensively. "Have you been locked in this empty house for all these days?"
"Of course I've been here," said Calendar. "Where else would I have been? That's when I decided. Finally, even though those fellows from Scotland Yard were here more than once and said there wasn't a soul about." Calendar nearly dropped his bottle, and after he caught it, he took a long drink. "Scotland Yard?"
"We naturally called them in when we couldn't find the girl, and they just as naturally sought to make inquiries of the man she was going to marry. I think they were suspicious of you until they got some information."
"Thank God for that," said Calendar. He sighed back on the bed. "Then I'm not suspected."
"Of course not. Look here, cousin, what's wrong with you? You don't seem to care what's happened to Felicia. Don't you want to hear what's become of her? She's been seen."
Stone paced indignantly across the room while Calendar attempted to collect his thoughts.
"Then she's safe?" he asked. "I suppose you could say that according to the law, but if you ask me, I'd say she was in mortal danger. She was seen with that man Newcastle."
Calendar leapt from his bed, still half-dressed in trousers and a soiled shirt.
"Newcastle?"
he shouted. He grasped his cousin by the collar and stared wildly into his eyes.
"What has he done with her?"
"I don't know, I'm sure," said Stone as he disengaged himself, "but the constable said she was wearing what he called a wedding gown."
"Didn't they stop her? Didn't they take her away with them? My God!"
"Well, they said there was no law against a girl getting married if she had a mind, or taking a walk with her husband in the night air if it came to that, even if it was in a graveyard. And I think he did something to frighten them." Calendar snatched up a coat that had been thrown over a chair and began to rummage through its pockets. Half of a broken walking stick rattled to the floor, but he ignored it. At last he found a bedraggled little book and waved it at his cousin with an air of triumph. He sat down heavily in the chair and began turning pages with intense concentration.
"He's done for me," he muttered, "and now I'll do for him."
"Look here, Reggie," began Stone.
"Quiet, you fool! Can't you see I'm reading?"
"I can see I'm no use here," said Stone, more baffled than ever, when he saw his cousin reach down for the broken stick and clutch it triumphantly. "I'll let myself out. But when you come to your senses, if you do, perhaps you'll do something to help us save Miss Lamb." He strode from the room and was halfway down the stairs when he heard Stone raving at him, or at Willard.
"Save her? Save her? I'm the only one who can! I'm the only one who knows how!"
Nigel Stone never looked back. He locked the front door behind him and stepped out into the afternoon, the first he'd seen with even a touch of sun since his arrival in London. He was content to take it as an omen. Elopements there might be, or even abductions and madness certainly, but what did they matter? He was on his way to meet Miss Penelope Lamb, and for his own part he was quite happy. A few minutes later, Reginald Calendar came out of the same door and squinted into the same sunlight. His hair was dishevelled, his cravat awry, his gaze unsteady. He tried to hail a cab, but the first two drivers merely glanced at him and then passed by. A third pulled to a stop a few yards down the street, and Calendar staggered after him. The cabman looked down from his perch. "Let's see the colour of your money before you climb aboard," he said. Calendar was obliged to go through his pockets once again. He pulled out Sully's Penny Dreadful, one half of a broken stick, and the other. A small flask completed the catalogue of his possessions. "Looks like you'd be walking," said the cabman as he trotted off. Calendar hurled Varney the Vampire after the retreating cab.
"I don't need this anymore," he screamed, "and I don't need you!"
He was suddenly aware that he'd attracted the attention of several passers-by, and that he was standing in the middle of a tranquil street wailing like a fishwife. He recognised a neighbour who had been accustomed to tip his hat, but now looked ostentatiously away. Calendar saw the two sharp sticks in the flask that he'd been waving in the air. He thrust them back into his coat and hurried away. It was a long walk to All Souls Cemetery. Calendar's mind raced faster than his feet could carry him, but his thoughts ran in circles. He had lost everything, his fortune, his mistress, his bride, and her fortune too. The list ran through his mind like a litany, so that he began to suspect he was losing his senses as well. In fact, he thought that he might welcome it if he were to go completely mad, but when his only alternative was to live in a world where he was besieged by devils. At least he knew who was to blame. Newcastle had even produced his uncle's ghost, and by this time Calendar was more than willing to believe that somehow the spiritualist had plundered his uncle's estate as well. But Newcastle wasn't a spiritualist, of course. He was a vampire. The explanation seemed so simple to Calendar now. Hadn't he heard Felicia holding forth on vampires just before she disappeared? Still, the one he really had to thank was Sally Wood, whose lurid little books on the subject had revealed not only the cause of his troubles, but a remedy for them. And if not a remedy, then at least revenge. Calendar felt a twinge of pity when he thought of Sally now. He wished he could have killed her quickly. His next killing would have to be quick, whether he wished it or not. Yes. Of course, he's a vampire. Yes, as the people who... Finally, he realises. As he approached Newcastle's house, he saw that the sun was low in the sky, behind the trees of All Souls. Could it really be that the dead would rise soon? He hurried towards Sebastian Newcastle's house, but what he saw there disturbed him even more than the setting sun. Before the entrance stood a man dressed in a long blue coat with brass buttons. Clearly the house was under the surveillance of Scotland Yard. Calendar hesitated. His plan had been to ransack the place, find Newcastle's undead corpse and bury his broken cane in it, but this would hardly be possible under the circumstances. He might get some information from the constable on guard, but he hardly liked the idea of presenting himself to the law when he was a murderer himself. Should he risk it, or should he run? His mouth was dry. He found the flask in his pocket and drained most of the port. The rest of it spilled down the front of his coat. The drink gave him the courage enough to approach the house and find out what he needed to know. He made an effort to regain his dignity, walking very carefully as he approached the lair of his nemesis. He decided as he took the last few steps that aggression might be more effective than supplication. "What's going on here?" he said. "Where's Mr. Newcastle?" "That's what we'd like to know, sir." "What's your business with him?" "He's eloped with my fiancée. Is that business enough?" "Oh, you Mr. Calendar? I've been wanting to talk to you. What do you know about all this?" "Nothing but what I've been told. I quarrelled with Miss Lamb about nothing, really, and now I hear this man has spirited her away. Have you any word of her?" "No more than that, sir. She was seen with him once, in that graveyard yonder, but only then, and only for a moment." "And have you searched the house?" demanded Calendar. "From top to bottom, sir." "Are you certain? This is a strange house, you know. One night when I was here, the very walls seemed to dissolve into a fog." "Indeed, sir. I've had nights like that myself. I seem to be having one now, if I may say so, if it ain't even night yet." Calendar ran the back of his hand over his dry lips. "How would you feel?" he asked. "What would you do? If I find this man in Newcastle, I'll kill him." "Well, sir, as to that, if a man ran off with my old woman, I'd buy him a drink. Hey, wouldn't take these things too serious." The constable paused and squinted at Calendar as if seeing him for the first time. "You wouldn't kill a lady, would you, sir?" Calendar swallowed hard. "Whatever do you mean?" he stammered. "Of course not." "Sometimes gentlemen use their heads in a manner of speaking, and Miss Lamb can't be found, you know." "You're a fool," said Calendar, turning on his heel. "That says maybe, sir," the constable shouted at Calendar's retreating back. "When we find you at home, if something should turn up." Calendar hurried off without bothering to reply. He could hardly have controlled himself for another second, especially when the talk of killing women started. The man seemed to be an ignorant commoner, but who could tell? As he passed the cemetery once again, Calendar noticed that the gates were open. He paused before them and peered in. This was where Felicia had been only a few hours before. If she and Newcastle were not in the house, might they not still be here? Calendar entered All Souls. The place was peaceful in the twilight, almost like a park, with its green grass and gently rolling hills. Birds sang in the trees and perched on figures of white marble. This was like a city of the dead, and Calendar hardly knew which way to turn in it. Rows of effigies and headstones stretched in every direction. In the distance lay clusters of white mausoleums. Almost helplessly, he moved along the streets of marble towards his Uncle William's tomb. There his torment had started. Perhaps it would end there too. He had a vision, half inspired by Sally's cheap fiction, of rushing to that pale edifice and finding Felicia imprisoned there, the victim of a villain he could vanquish with one blow of his ebony stick. He longed to be a hero almost as much as he longed for another drink. He prayed to be free of his nightmare. When he reached his goal, however, he found an avenging angel posed before it. Sitting in front of his uncle's final resting place was another man dressed in blue. His left hand was wrapped in bandages. "Mr. Calendar," he said, "paying your last respects." "I don't know you," said Calendar as he backed away. "We shall be better acquainted then. What brings you here this evening?" It took Calendar some time to find his lung. "I'm told Miss Lamb was seen here," he found it. "This very spot? Who told you that? None of my men, I'll warrant you." "This is the only spot I know," said Calendar. "My uncle is interred behind you." "Oh, I see. And does he lie alone?" "Is there someone else?" gasped Calendar. Felicia, Newcastle? Neither of those, sir, said the chief constable. And where are they? We don't know yet, the chief constable stood up. We do know there are 2 bodies in that tomb that don't belong there, both of them horribly mutilated. The bodies of 2 young boys. What do you make of that, Mr. Calendar, sir? Calendar backed away, almost convinced that this was another of his drunken dreams. The man from Scotland Yard just stared at him. Calendar wheeled around and ran. Running suited him, Calendar decided. His lungs rasped, his heart thumped, and his stomach churned, but he was leaving everything behind him. When he glanced back, the immobile man in blue had dwindled to a tiny figure, no more threatening than a toy soldier. Still, under darkening skies, Calendar ran. He ran past monuments and mausoleums, through iron gates, then down streets where living men and women walked, who scattered at the sight of him. He tumbled into the gutter once, and when he rose, he was face to face with a lamplighter on his rounds. "So soon!" screamed Calendar as he raced on. He knew that he must be home before night fell. He could hardly believe his good fortune when he reached the ugly, empty house that was his sanctuary. He fumbled for his key and howled in agony when it was nowhere to be found. In panic, he pounded on the door, then to his amazement felt it open for him. Dimly, he recalled that he'd never had his key and he'd never locked the house. He slammed his door on the sunset and turned the bolt behind him. He was safe. Calendar sank to his knees in the dark hallway. He was ruined, and he acknowledged it. He wandered through the hollow rooms when the last rays of the day died outside. He was on the verge of tears, and he hated himself for that. The tears might have been for Felicia Lamb, or for Sally Wood, or even for Uncle William, but all of these had betrayed him. Calendar wept for himself. It made no difference. He beat his hands against bare walls, he cursed the universe. He did not care. At length his desolation brought him to himself, which was all he had left to him. It was not enough. He could at least have a bottle to keep him company. In the last week he had learned the way to the wine cellar. He thought he might take residence there among the dusty bottles and the crates of cloth his cousin had brought back from India. He could make a bed for himself in the worthless textiles, and the wine would be close at hand. The idea pleased him. He made his way through the kitchen and the pantry, where he found the stove of a candle to light his way. The dark stairs were old friends to him, and the dark vault that he had reached was refuge. He found the shelves where the old port rested and picked the best vintage left to him. He broke the top off the bottle and poured out the rich, red liquid down his throat. He had to spit out a chip of glass, but at least it had only cut his lip. He sat down in the dust and looked around. He drank again, but sometimes he noticed that something had been disturbed. One of the heavy boxes from India had been removed from the pile and sat in the middle of the cellar. Its lid was loose. Calendar approached it cautiously. He left the candle on the floor to keep both hands free, and as soon as he touched the top of the box, he clattered to the stones below. There seemed to be nothing more inside than bolts of dyed cotton, but Calendar was dissatisfied. He pulled the coloured cloth aside. Beneath it was the face of Sebastian Newcastle. Calendar was too stunned to relish the sight, but only for a moment. He found the lair of the vampire in the foundations of his own house. Felicia might be anywhere, in any state, but at least her betrayer had betrayed himself. Calendar chuckled at the clever ruse that had gone awry. No doubt the vampire had imagined himself ingeniously concealed. He had not realised that Calendar's thirst was as ravenous as his own. Calendar tossed more cotton to the floor and saw Sebastian Newcastle naked to the waist. Away. The sight of this nude seducer drove him to a frenzy. There were There were shadows all around him, and Calendar knew that the sun had set. He knew the monster might leap up and devour him. He pulled half of the broken cane out of his coat. One end was needle-sharp. He needed something to strike the fatal blow, and he needed it at once. The heavy butt end of the wine bottle would do. Calendar felt his own heart beating wildly, and this helped him to select the precise spot where he would strike. He placed the jagged point against the cold, smooth skin. He smashed the shaft down with the heavy glass. The ebony ripped through the yielding flesh, and a high-pitched wail was forced from the corpse's lips, startling Calendar into striking again and again. Each blow produced a delicate moan that made his skin crawl. The death agonies were uncanny. Something was wrong. The vampire's body began to shake. It thrashed from side to side, then crumbled like a hollow shell. Pieces of flesh dropped away. A glass eye rolled across the cellar. The skin shattered. Something was breaking free. Shards of Sebastian flew in all directions, and others settled into the box. Most of his face came to rest beside the other face beneath it. Felicia Lamb lay among the wax fragments, the sharp shaft of Calendar's broken cane embedded in her breast. Calendar wondered why she didn't bleed. Shards of Sebastian is a good band name, yeah. Shards of Wax Sebastian. That's what they called me. No. Her golden hair... he had no way of knowing that there was not a drop of blood inside her. She was as white as a marble statue. Her golden hair, unleashed as he had never seen it, spread around her head like a halo. And all about her were parts of a waxen man, the remnants of Newcastle's last cruel joke. Calendar thought he saw Felicia's lashes flutter, her lips part, her fingers reaching towards her shattered heart. Then she was still, garbed in a gown of pure white silk. She looked like a sleeping angel. His candle flared for an instant. Calendar laughed. He could hardly help himself. He picked up the bits of wax and smashed them underfoot. He found another bottle and broke its neck, drinking from the sharp glass that sliced into his lips. He heard footsteps over his head, and knowing that they came for him, he laughed again. They found him there. His mouth dribbling blood, beside the punctured corpse of his beloved. The sound of his incoherent voice had drawn them to them. There were 3 men in blue, one of them holding a lantern in his bandaged hand. Behind them came Nigel Stone, apologetically brandishing a key. The light sent shadows shimmering all over the wine cellar. "Mr. Calendar," said the Chief Constable, "what have you been doing to Miss Lamb?" "11. The conscientious cousin." Mr. and Mrs. Nigel Stone sat side by side on a horsehair settee and shared a bottle of fine old sherry. Their wedding might have been a hasty one, but as Mrs. Stone observed, a hasty wedding was better than none at all. And furthermore, their union served to disperse the sadness that might have blighted both their lives. "To think that I married a hero," chirped Mrs. Stone. "Not really," murmured Mr. Stone. "I only let the fellows in to capture him." "But you might have been killed," she said. "I suppose so. He did have another half of that stick in his coat." "I found a brave man, inherited a fortune in the same week," said Mrs. Stone. "Was any woman ever so blessed?" "Oh, I don't know," said Mr. Stone. "I've come home from years in the wilderness, and right away I found a charming bride. Surely I'm the lucky one." The bride and groom exchanged chaste kisses. "Did you hear that Madame Tussaud will be putting poor Felicia and your cousin on display?" asked Mrs. Stone. "They'll be part of a large addition to the debris. It pleases me to think the poor girl won't be forgotten." "Indeed," said Mr. Stone. "Would it be in bad taste for us to visit the display?" Just as you think best, Penelope." Mrs. Stone took a thoughtful sip of sherry. "And what of Mr. Newcastle?" she asked. "Has he been found?" "Not a trace of him, I'm afraid," said Mrs. Stone. "The police think Reggie might have done away with him as well, and of course that's what the fool said he'd done when he shoved that stick into Felicia's heart." "Yes," said Mrs. Stone. "Was there much blood?" "What? I didn't really like to look at her, to tell you the truth. She seemed quite clean, though, really, but poor old Reggie had blood all over his mouth." "And had he really lost his mind?" "What other explanation could there be for such unchivalrous behaviour?" Mr. Stone filled both their glasses. "I wonder if they'll keep him in the madhouse or just take him out and hang him. I wish there was more I could do for him somehow." "I hardly think you need concern yourself after his barbaric treatment of my niece." "As you say, Penelope. At least I did him one good turn." "What's that?" "And what's that?" "A small thing, really. I went back to the house the day after it all happened and found a packing crate in the hallway." "A packing crate?" "Yes, and quite a large one. It was sealed and the labels were on it, so I took it on myself to have it sent on, though heaven knows what business Reggie could have in India." "India?" "It was addressed to some fellow in Calcutta. I don't remember who it was, but it looked to me like some sort of Spanish name." "A Spanish name?" said Mrs. Stone. "Oh, dear." And that is all of Yellow Fog, which has taken me approximately an hour and 2.5 hours to go through. I think I have the energy for the Vintage Domestic, because Vintage Domestic is 2, 3, about 6 pages. But oh boy, I've inhaled so much and so frequently, I'm slightly lightheaded. So I'm going to take the break I probably should have taken quite some time ago. Probably about 8 o'clock. And I will be back and I will read the rest of Vintage Domestic after I've popped to the loo. So go hydrate, do all the evolutionary things, eat if you need to, that kind of thing. And I'll be back in about 5 minutes. Green screen. You saw nothing. I tell you what, with Don Sebastian, I'm like, yeah, they make jokes about Dracula spelling your name backwards doesn't fool anybody, and then this purported aged genius magician, like his secret identity, and his name is Don Sebastian de Villanueva, and his secret identity is Sebastian Newcastle. That's literally the same name, just in English instead of in Spanish. Come on, you can come up with something better than that. Yeah, like it's just the same name, but just translated. Come on. It is I, Don Sebastian Newcastle. Okay, right. On to vintage domestic. I think everybody's seen the content warnings by now, haven't they? This, I should warn you, of all the stories in this book, this one is the one that actually squicks me out. Properly squicks me out. So, content warning called Bleh. So, this is Steve Rasnic Tem, vintage domestic. Steve Rasnic Tem lives with his wife, writer Melanie Tem, who one of whose stories is previously in this book, in a supposedly haunted Victorian house in Denver, Colorado. One of the most prolific authors currently working in the anthology and small press markets, recent appearances have included Fantasy Tales 4, Pulp House 7, Psychopaths 2, New Crimes 3, Best New Horror and Best New Horror 2, The Year's Best Fantasy and Horror, In Dreams, Tales of the Wandering Jew, The Daedalus Book of Femme Fatales, that sounds fun, Snow White, Blood Red, Gauntlet 3, and the chapbook Absences, Charlie Good's Ghost. His short fiction was collected by publisher Denuel in France under the title Ombre sur la route, Shadows on the Road, I think, and his novel Excavation appeared in 1987. The powerful story that follows is original to this collection. She used to tell him that they'd have the house forever. One day their children would live there. When Jack grew too old to walk or to feed himself, she would take care of him in this house. She would feed him right from her own mouth with a kiss. He'd always counted on her keeping this promise. But as her condition worsened, as the changes accelerated, he realised that this was a promise she could not keep. The roles would be reversed, and it would be he who fed his lifetime lover with a kiss full of raw meat and blood. Sweet domestic vintage. Early in their marriage, his wife had told him that there was a history of depression in her family. That's the way members of the family always talked about it. The sadness, the melancholy, the long, slow condition. Before he understood what this meant, he hadn't taken it that seriously, because at the time she never seemed depressed. Once their two oldest reached the teen years, however, she became sad and slow to move, her eyes dark stones in the clay mask of her face, and she stopped telling him about her family's history of depression. When he asked her about the old story, she acted as if she didn't know what he was talking about. At some point during her rapid deterioration, someone had labelled this family possibly dysfunctional. Follow-up visits from teachers and social workers had removed possibly from his family's thickening file. Studies and follow-up studies had been completed, detailed reports and addenda analysing his children's behaviour and the family dynamics. He had fought them all the way, perhaps they had tired of the issue, because when they finally gave up on their investigations, his family had weathered their accusations. He had protected his wife and children, fulfilled his obligations. Finally, people left them alone, but they could not see that something sacred was occurring in this house. The house grew old quickly, but not as quickly as his wife and children. "You're so damn cheerful all the time," she said to him. "It makes me sick." This is by an American, actually. Okay. "You're so damn cheerful all the time," she said to him. "It makes me sick." At one time that might have been a joke. Looking into her grey eyes at this moment, he knew it was not. "I'm maintaining," he said. "That's all." He thought maybe her vision was failing her. He was sure it had been months since he'd last smiled. He bent over her with the tea and passed her a cracker. She stretched her neck and tried to catch his lips in her teeth. He expected a laugh, but it didn't come. "You love me?" she asked, her voice flat and dusty. He put the cracker in his mouth and let her take it from his lips. He could hear his teenage daughters in the next room moaning from the bed. They'd been there 2 months already, maybe more. She reached up with a brittle touch across his cheek. "You take after me, you know?" And then she did smile, then opened her mouth around a dry cough of a laugh. Downstairs, their 7-year-old son made loud motorcycle noises with moist lips and tongue. Thank God he takes after his father, he thought, and would have laughed if he could. Behind him, his sweet wife moaned, her lips cracked and peeling. A white tongue flickered like the corner of a starched handkerchief. He bit down hard into the tender scar on the inside of his mouth. He ground one tooth, two through the sensitive pain. When he tasted salt, he began to suck, mixing the salt and iron taste with the saliva that had become remarkable in its quantity, until the frothy red cocktail was formed. He bent over his lips with this beverage kiss and allowed her tongue to meet his razor teeth still held back in supplication. In this way he fed her, when she could no longer feed herself, when she could not move, when she could not hunt, when in their house tall curtains of dust floated gently around them. "The girls," she said, once her handkerchief tongue was soaked, and her pale lips glistened pinkly. But he still could not go into his daughter's bedroom and had to listen to them moan their hunger like pale and hairless motherless rats. "Tell me again, Jack," his wife whispered wetly from the bed. "Tell me again how wonderful life is." These were among the last words she would ever use with him. The young man at the front door wore the blue uniform of the delivery service. Overripe brown sacks filled each of his arms, blending into his fat cheeks as if part of them. He smiled all the time. Jack smiled a hungry smile back. "Your groceries, sir." Behind him were the stirrings of dry skin against cloth, insect legs, pleadings too starved and faint to be heard clearly. As the young man handed the sacks over to him, Jack's fingertips brushed the pale backs of the man's hands. He imagined he could feel the heat there, the youthful coursing through the veins, feeding pale tissues, warming otherwise cold meat. Sometimes he took his daughters hunting if they were strong enough, but so far he'd been able to limit them to slugs, worms, insects, small animals. He wondered how long he could hold them to that, when the stores kept sending them tender young delivery boys. He wondered how long it would be before his daughters were as immobile as his wife, begged him to bring them something more. Somewhere behind him there was a tiny gasp, the rising pressure of tears which could not fall. Some evenings he would sit up talking to his family long into the night. They did not always respond precisely to his confessions of loneliness, of dreams which did not include them, and he wondered if it was because of the doors that separated them from him. Sometimes he would go to the closet doors and open them, where his wife stood, folded back against the wall with the coats and robes, where his daughters leaned one against each other like ancient lesbian mops. "Kiss us," the dry whisper came from somewhere within the pale flaps of their faces. Jack still loved them desperately, but he could not do what they asked. His youngest, his only son, had taken to his bed. Jack brought his daughters mice and roaches he'd killed himself. They sucked on them like sugar candy until most of the colour was gone and then they spat them out. Months ago they'd stopped having their periods. The last few times had been pale, pink and runny, and Jack had cried for them, then cleaned them up with old burlap sacks. His son disappeared from his bed one evening. Jack found him standing in the closet, his eyes full of moths, his hands stiffened into hooks. Later his son would disappear from time to time, sometimes showing up in one of the other closets, clutching at his mother or sisters, sometimes curled up inside the empty toy box. The boy had no more use for toys, having his own body to play with. Sometimes he'd chew a finger into odd shapes. Jack continued to feed his wife from his own mouth. Sometimes his mouth was so raw he could not tear any more skin off the insides. Then he'd bite through a rat or a bird himself, holding its rank warmth into his cheeks until he'd deliver their meal. She returned his kisses greedily, always wanting more than he could provide, but he had spoiled her. She would not feed any other way. His son became a good hunter, and sometimes Jack would hear him feeding on the other side of the closet door. Pets began disappearing from the neighbourhood, and Jack stopped answering the door, even for delivery boys. His daughters became despondent and refused to eat. When he opened their closet door, they tried to disguise themselves as abandoned brooms. Finally, Jack had to hold them one at a time, forcing his blood-smeared tongue past their splintered lips into the dry sustenance of their mouths, so that they might leach nourishment. Once he'd overcome their initial resistance, they scraped his tongue clean, then threatened to carve it down to the root, but Jack always knew the exact moment to pull out. Sometimes he wondered if they still considered him a good father, an adequate husband. He tried singing his children lullabies, reciting poetry to his wife. They nodded their full heads of dust in the gale of his breath, but said nothing. When the food delivery boys no longer came, he saved a portion of his kills for himself. And whenever possible, he swallowed his own bloody wet kisses and tried to remember the feel of his wife's hands on his back, on his face, back when her skin was soft and her breath was sweet. In the house around him, he knew 100 heartbeats, desperately chasing life's apprehensions through a race course of his veins. He tried to ignore the hunger brought on by such thinking. He tried to picture his neighbours' faces, but he could not. His family became so light he could carry them about the house without effort. If he hadn't heard their close whispers, he might have thought of them a few old towels thrown across his shoulder. Sometimes he would set them down and forget them, later rushing around in panic to find out where they'd been mislaid. The lighter, the thinner they became, the more blood they seemed to require. When his mouth became too sore to chew, he would apply razor blades to the scar tissue, slicing through new white skin into the thicker layers beneath, finally into muscle so that the blood would fill his mouth to spilling before he could get his mouth completely over theirs. Blood stained their thin chests with a rough crimson bib. And still they grew thinner, their bones growing fibrous and pulpy before beginning to dissolve altogether. He made long rips in his forearms, his thighs, his calves, and held his wife and children up to drink there. The blood soaked through the tissues of their flesh, through the translucent fibres of their hair, washing through their skin until in the dusty shadows of the house they looked vaguely tanned. But almost as quickly they were pale again and thin as distant memory. He took to slicing off hunks of thigh muscle, severing fingertips and toes. His family ate for months off the bloody bits, their small rat teeth nibbling listlessly. They had ceased using words of any kind long ago, so they couldn't express their thanks. But Jack didn't mind. This was the family he'd always dreamed of. The look of appreciation in their colourless eyes was thanks enough. At first he tore his clothes to rags to staunch the blood, but even the rags eventually fell apart. One day, seeing his son sucking up the last bit of red from a torn twist of cloth, he decided to forego the last vestiges of his modesty and throw the ragged clothes away. After that time he would only walk about the dreary old house naked, wearing the paper-thin bodies of his family wrapped around him, their mouths fixed tightly to his oozing wounds. This went on for months, wearing his family constantly, their feeding so regular and persistent that it seemed to alter the very rhythm of his heart. He would wake up in the middle of the night to the soft sucking noise their lips and teeth made against his flesh. He would awaken a few hours later, and the first thing he'd see was the stupid look in their eyes as they gazed up at him in adoration. He was pleased to see that such constant nourishment fattened them, and brought colour to their skin, so that eventually they fell off his body from the sheer weight of them. Wriggling about his feet at first, they eventually decided to explore the house on their own. Obviously they felt far healthier than before. Again, they did not thank him, but what did a good husband and father need of thanks? They soon grew thin again, soft and transparent. After a year, he had not seen them again, although occasionally he might swear to a face hidden within the upholstery, an eye rolling past a furniture leg, a dry mouth praying silently among the houseplants filmed in the dark fairy dust. After 5 years, even the garbled whispering had stopped. He continued to watch over the house, intent on his obligation, and after preparing a blood kiss in the pale vacancy of his mouth, he was content to drink it himself.
Oh, I don't like that one. That one's really visceral.
Right, I got through it though. Yeah, do that one soon. We'll do that. So, all that remains now is Kim Newman's Red Rain and Neil Gaiman's Vampire Sistina. And Red Rain is about that thick, which is not even as long as Yellow Fog was, I think. So eventually I will do the last session of the giant book of vampires. But thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed yourself. I will put it on YouTube for people who missed bits of it. Excuse me. So hopefully in 2 weeks' time, provided my D&D game doesn't get moved around or anything like that, I'll do the last session. But by all means follow the channel if you want a warning about it. So without any further ado, I shall say good night out there, whatever you are.